The dust of Troy hangs thick in the air, a gritty, suffocating cloud stirred by years of relentless warfare. On the plains before that legendary city, the greatest hero of the Trojans, the noble Hector, lies broken in the dirt. The Greek champion who struck him down stands victorious, a terrifying figure of bronze and rage, his glory absolute and his vengeance complete. This is one of the most iconic moments in all of ancient storytelling, a scene that has echoed for millennia. But in that singular, triumphant instant, a question burns, a mystery that transcends the immediate victory. What about the man who killed him, who was Achilles really? We know the name, of course. We know the legend of his near invincibility, his famous heel. But the true story of Achilles is so much more than a single vulnerability or a single duel. It is a sweeping epic of divine intervention and human passion, a heartbreaking exploration of a man caught between the desire for eternal glory and the simple, human longing for a life of peace and meaning. It's a story that asks us what we would sacrifice for our name to be remembered forever, and whether that remembrance is worth the ultimate price. Today, we are going to unravel the full, magnificent tapestry of his life, from his miraculous, extraordinary birth to his tragic, prophesied death. This isn't just a recounting of old myths. It is an invitation to walk alongside one of the most complex figures ever conceived by the human imagination. We will witness the impossible choice his mother tried to make for him, a choice between a long, anonymous life and a short, brilliant one blazing across the heavens of history. We will see his explosive entry into the Trojan War, a conflict he tried to avoid but was ultimately powerless to escape, bound by his own code of honor and the fierce loyalty of his closest companion. This journey will take us deep into the heart of what it means to be a hero, to be gifted by the gods with unparalleled skill, and yet be cursed with all too human emotions, searing rage, profound love, and devastating grief. So prepare to step into a world where gods walk among mortals and fate is a thread that can be pulled but never truly cut. This is the story of Achilles in its entirety, a grand adventure of human drama that remains startlingly relatable. It's a tale for anyone who has ever wrestled with their own destiny, felt the burning sting of pride, or faced the hollow ache of a devastating loss. It is a story about the choices that define us and the legacies we leave behind. Join us now as we trace the entire arc of this legendary warrior's life, uncovering the man behind the myth, the hero beneath the helmet, and the timeless truths his story still whispers to us across the ages. Our story doesn't begin with a warrior, but with a prophecy, a whispered secret of the future that would cast a long and inescapable shadow over the life of a boy not yet born. The central figure in this prelude is not Achilles himself, but his mother, the sea nymph Thetis. A goddess of the ocean's depths, she was so radiant and powerful that two of the most formidable gods, Zeus and Poseidon, themselves vied for her hand. But their pursuit was cut short by a terrifying revelation. The Fates, the three ancient sisters who spin, measure, and cut the thread of every life, divine or mortal, had decreed a chilling destiny for Thetis' future son. They foretold that this child would grow to become a man far greater than his own father. For Zeus, the king of the gods, this was an unacceptable threat. His entire rule was built upon overthrowing his own father, Cronus, and the last thing he wanted was a powerful son rising to challenge him. So, in a move of cold, political calculation, the gods decided to neutralize the threat by marrying Thetis off to a mortal. Her divine son would then be no threat to Olympus, his greatness confined to the human world. The chosen groom was Peleus, a worthy and respected king of the Myrmidons, but a mortal nonetheless. This union between an immortal sea nymph and a mortal man was the first attempt to cheat destiny, a desperate compromise forced upon Thetis by the very powers that ruled the universe. But for Thetis, the prophecy was far more personal and horrifying than a simple political problem. the fates had whispered the second, more devastating part of their decree. Her son, this child of such immense potential, was doomed to die young. His life would be spectacular, a blaze of glory that would etch his name into history forever, but it would be painfully, tragically short, cut down in the prime of his youth during a great upcoming war. This is the impossible choice placed at the heart of the Achilles myth from the very beginning. The choice between a long, quiet, and forgotten life, or a short, brilliant, and eternally remembered one. As a mother, Thetis's only goal became to protect her child from this grim future. Her marriage to a mortal was the first layer of her defense, but once her son, Achilles, was born, her efforts became frantic and direct. She knew his mortal half, inherited from his father Peleus, was his vulnerability. So she devised a desperate ritual to burn away his human frailty and make him truly immortal like her. The most famous version of this story tells of her anointing the infant's body with ambrosia, the food of the gods, by day, and then by night she would lay him in the hearth's fire to scorch away his mortal flesh. It was a terrifying, divine act of motherly love, an attempt to rewrite his very nature. But one night Peleus witnessed this shocking scene, his wife holding their baby in the flames, and he cried out in horror, shattering the ritual. Thetis, furious and distraught that her plan had been ruined, abandoned both her mortal husband and Mount Pelion, returning forever to the sea. In that single, interrupted moment, Achilles' fate was sealed. He was left a demigod, possessing near-invincible power, but crucially, he retained one small, mortal point of failure. So, there in the flickering firelight of their home, Thetis enacted her desperate, divine plan. By day, she would anoint the infant Achilles with sacred ambrosia, the very food of the gods, rubbing its divine essence into his tiny limbs to grant him the immortality of Olympus. But by night, she would perform a far more terrifying ritual. She would place her son within the hearth's fire, not to harm him, but to sear away his mortal, human parts. The legacy of his father, Peleus, leaving only the pure, imperishable divinity inherited from her. Imagine the scene, the shadows dancing on the walls, the crackle of the logs, and a mother calmly holding her baby in the heart of the flames, watching as his mortal flesh blackened and fell away like ash. For her, this was not an act of cruelty, but of ultimate love and protection, a radical, painful process of purification to shield him from the death the fates had promised. It was a race against destiny itself, and for a time it seemed to be working. Night after night, the child emerged stronger, more radiant, closer to being a true god. But this fragile hope was shattered in an instant. One night, King Peleus, drawn by some paternal instinct or a strange noise, stumbled upon the unthinkable sight, his wife cradling their son in the heart of the fire. He saw not the divine magic, only the terrifying image of his child seemingly being burned alive. A cry of pure horror erupted from him, a mortal's reaction to a scene he could not possibly comprehend. That single, anguished shout broke the nymph's intense concentration, rupturing the sacred spell. The magic dissipated instantly, and with it, Thetis's last, best chance to save her son. Furious that her husband's mortal fear had undone everything and heartbroken by the failure, Thetis could no longer bear her life among humans. She dropped the child, now forever changed but crucially unfinished, and fled back to the depths of the sea, abandoning Peleus and Mount Pelion forever. In that moment, Achilles was left in a state of profound and tragic paradox. The fire had rendered his body nearly invulnerable, a living fortress, but the ritual's interruption meant one small part of him remained untouched by the divine flames, the heel by which his mother had held him. That single spot on his foot retained all the fragility of his mortality, a tiny, hidden flaw in an otherwise perfect demigod. This is the brilliant, heartbreaking core of his entire being. He is not a god, nor is he simply a man. He is a hybrid, a being of two worlds, forever tormented by the conflict within him. He possesses the power, pride, and potential of the divine, yet he is shackled to the finite, emotional, and vulnerable existence of a human. That unscorched heel is more than a physical vulnerability. It is a symbol of his entire tragic condition, the part of him that is forever and irrevocably mortal, a ticking clock counting down to the destiny his mother fought so desperately to erase. Yet there is another, even more famous version of the story, a tale so deeply woven into our culture that it has given its name to the one weakness in any seemingly perfect system. This is the myth of the river Styx. After her initial attempts to burn away his mortality failed, Thetis, ever the resourceful and desperate mother, turned to a different kind of magic, one that flowed through the very underworld itself. The river Styx was not just any body of water, it was the sacred boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, a dark, powerful current that circled the underworld 9 times. Its waters were imbued with an ancient, binding power so potent that even the gods swore their most sacred oaths upon it. Thetis believed that by immersing her son in these mythical waters, she could grant him a different kind of invincibility, not by changing his nature, but by armoring his body against any weapon a mortal or god could wield. So she took the infant Achilles down to the banks of that fearsome river, a place shrouded in mist and echoes. Holding him firmly by one of his heels, she plunged his tiny body completely into the black, chilling current. As the waters of the Styx swirled around him, they worked their magic, sealing his skin and flesh with a divine protection, rendering him impervious to harm. Every part of him that the sacred water touched became invulnerable, but where Thetis's fingers gripped his foot, where her skin made contact with his, a small patch of his heel remained dry, untouched by the potent magic. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant oversight, a mere square inch on an otherwise perfect defensive shield. In that single, dry spot, all his mortality was concentrated. That one vulnerable point, the legendary Achilles' heel, would become the most famous weakness in all of literature. But this story is far more than just an inventive explanation for a warrior's death. The Achilles' heel is a profound and timeless symbol, a narrative representation of a universal truth that applies to heroes, leaders, and every one of us. It teaches us that no being, no matter how powerful, gifted, or seemingly perfect, is without a point of failure. For the mighty, their strength often contains the seed of their downfall. For the brilliant, their intelligence can sometimes blind them to simple truths. And for a hero like Achilles, his physical invulnerability was perfectly mirrored and ultimately undermined by his psychological and emotional vulnerabilities. His true heel, the flaw that would truly lead to his destruction, was not a spot on his body, but the raging fire within his own spirit. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of fatal flaw: hubris. This is much more than simple pride or arrogance. Hubris is an overweening, excessive self-confidence that leads a person to challenge the gods themselves, to believe they are above the natural order, or to disregard the fundamental laws of humanity. It is the pride that comes before a fall, the arrogance that invites catastrophe. Achilles was a vessel for this kind of pride. He knew he was the best of the Greeks, the swiftest, the strongest, the deadliest warrior on the field. His very identity was built upon this excellence, this aristeia. But that same sense of supreme self-worth made him dangerously volatile, incapable of accepting any slight to his honor, no matter the cost to himself or his allies. We can see this fatal pride burning at the center of his every major decision. When the Greek commander Agamemnon dishonors him by taking his war prize, the maiden Briseis, Achilles' reaction is not just one of anger but of cosmic, all-consuming rage. His pride is so deeply wounded that he withdraws his crucial military might from the battle, praying to his mother Thetis to actually make the Greeks start losing the war, just so they will understand how much they need him. He is willing to let his own comrades die in droves, to risk the entire war effort, all to prove a point about his own personal honor. This is not the calculated move of a general. It is the petulant, prideful act of a man who believes his individual status is more important than the collective goal. His hubris creates a chain of events that leads directly to the death of his closest friend, Patroclus, a loss that shatters him. And even in his final confrontation with Hector, it is his pride that refuses to grant the Trojan hero a proper burial, instead desecrating his body by dragging it behind his chariot, an act of such shocking disrespect that it offends the gods themselves. So, while an arrow guided by the god Apollo would eventually find that literal physical heel, it was his hubris, his monumental pride, that truly guided that arrow to its mark. The dry spot on his foot was just the entry point. The path was cleared by the flaws in his own magnificent, tragic character. The myth of the heel, therefore, is a perfect metaphor. It reminds us that our greatest strengths are often inseparable from our most profound weaknesses, and that the very thing that makes us exceptional can also be the source of our ultimate undoing. Left behind on the shores of mortality, the young Achilles was not raised in the gilded cage of a typical prince. His father, Peleus, haunted by the departure of Thetis and fearful of the prophecies that still swirled around his son, made a decision of desperate wisdom. He sent the boy away to be educated by a tutor unlike any other, a figure who stood at the very crossroads of the wild and the civilized, the centaur Chiron. Unlike the savage, lustful centaurs of popular myth, Chiron was a being of profound knowledge and gentle temperament, a master of healing, prophecy, and the arts. In the hidden caves and sun-dappled forests of Mount Pelion, the young demigod found not just a teacher, but a foster father. Under Chiron's watchful eye, Achilles' education began, and it was here that the raw material of his divine power was deliberately and carefully sculpted into the form of a true hero. This was not a training regimen designed to create a mere killing machine. It was a holistic cultivation of mind, body, and spirit, an attempt to forge a complete human being who could wield his immense gifts with wisdom as well as force. Chiron understood that true excellence, what the Greeks called arete, encompassed far more than martial prowess. It was a harmony of competing virtues, the strength of the warrior balanced by the compassion of the healer, the ferocity of the hunt paired with the serenity found in music. Imagine the scene, a clearing in an ancient forest where a centaur, half man, half horse, patiently guides the hand of a golden-haired boy. Here, Achilles learned the art of the lyre, his fingers plucking melodies that could soothe a restless heart or stir the soul to action. He was taught the complex, intricate epics of heroes who came before him, stories of daring and tragedy that laid the moral and cultural groundwork for his own world. He learned the delicate science of herbs and poultices from the being revered as the father of medicine himself, understanding how to mend wounds as well as inflict them. This knowledge of healing was not a separate skill from warfare. It was its essential counterpart, a constant reminder of the physical cost of conflict and the sacred duty to preserve life where possible. Of course, the physical training was relentless and unparalleled. Chiron, the consummate archer, taught him to handle the bow with unerring accuracy. He schooled him in the use of the spear, the sword, and the shield, transforming his natural strength and preternatural speed into a disciplined, lethal art form. He was trained in the pancration, a brutal and virtually rule-less form of combat that combined wrestling and boxing, forging a fighter who was as dangerous without a weapon as he was with one. Yet, even in this, Chiron's teachings were nuanced. The hunt was as much about patience, strategy, and respect for the natural world as it was about the final, fatal strike. This unique upbringing created a profound and often overlooked duality within Achilles. He was not a simple brute, he was a cultured warrior, a musician who could shift in an instant into the most fearsome combatant the world would ever know. We see echoes of this complex education throughout his story. In the lulls during the long siege of Troy, it is Achilles who is described in his tent, soothing his own turbulent spirit and that of his companion Patroclus by playing the lyre and singing of the glorious deeds of men. This is the boy Chiron, raised a soul capable of being moved by beauty and song, even amid the horrors of war. This duality is the core of his tragedy. Chiron gave him all the tools for a life of profound meaning and balanced excellence, gifting him with the civilized arts to temper his divine, savage power. Yet, for all the centaur's wisdom, he could not inoculate his pupil against the tumultuous, all-too-human passions that would ultimately define his fate. The very education that made him so brilliantly complex also made his subsequent pride-driven rages all the more devastating. He knew the harmony of music, yet chose the discord of wrath. He understood the art of healing, yet caused immeasurable suffering. He was in every sense the perfect hero, whose most formidable enemy was never on the battlefield of Troy, but within the conflicted landscape of his own magnificent heart. Despite the profound education and near-invincible body that Chiron had given him, a shadow still loomed over Achilles' future, a prophecy that his mother Thetis could never forget. She knew with a certainty that chilled her divine heart that if her son ever sailed for Troy, he would never return. The Trojan War was brewing, a conflict destined to become the most famous in history, and it was a conflict that demanded the greatest warrior of the age. As the Greek armies began to muster, Thetis made one last, desperate and cunning attempt to cheat fate itself. She would not risk her son's life on the battlefield. Instead, she devised a plan of subterfuge, pulling him from the world of men and weapons and hiding him in the one place she thought no one would ever think to look, a court of women. She whisked the teenage Achilles away to the island of Scyros, to the palace of King Lycomedes. There, she presented him not as a warrior, but as a maiden, a new companion for the king's many daughters. Imagine the surreal scene: the greatest martial prodigy of his generation, a young man forged in the wilds with a centaur and blessed with explosive strength, now forced to walk in flowing robes, to lower his voice and to keep his powerful, calloused hands hidden. He was given a new name, Pirha, meaning the fair-haired one, a delicate pseudonym for a figure of such raw power. This was Thetis's ultimate act of maternal protection, a daring gamble to conceal her son's destiny behind a veil of silk and anonymity. Life on Scyros was a world turned upside down for Achilles. The days that were once filled with the strain of combat drills and the thrill of the hunt were now occupied with the quiet, domestic rhythms of the women's quarters. He learned to weave, to walk with a demure grace, and to participate in the gentle gossip and song of the princesses. For a spirit as fiercely proud and active as his, this confinement must have been a special kind of torment, a cage far more frustrating than any battlefield. Yet within this strange and secret world, a different kind of drama began to unfold. Among the daughters of King Lycomedes was the princess Deidamia. She was sharp, observant, and unlike the others, she saw through the delicate facade. Perhaps it was the way he moved with a predator's unconscious grace, or the way his eyes held a fire that no timid maidens ever could. She recognized the man hidden beneath the woman's garments. Instead of exposing him, however, Deidamia became his confidante, the sole keeper of his true identity in that gilded prison. In the hidden corners of the palace gardens and the secluded rooms away from prying eyes, a bond formed between them, a secret romance blossoming in the shadow of the disguise. This relationship was far more than a simple youthful fling. It was a profound human connection for Achilles, an island of authenticity in a sea of deception. In Deidamia, he found not just a lover but an ally, someone who saw and accepted the warrior he truly was, even as he was forced to play the part of a girl. This secret life, however, could not remain hidden forever. The Greek commanders, led by the cunning Odysseus, had heard the same prophecy. They knew the war against Troy could not be won without Achilles. When rumors reached them that the young demigod was hidden on Scyros, they devised a clever plan to smoke him out. Odysseus, the master of tricks, arrived at the court of King Lycomedes not as a warrior demanding a recruit, but as a merchant peddling his wares. He presented himself to the assembled women of the court, displaying a dazzling array of fine fabrics, glittering jewels, and delicate trinkets. But hidden among these feminine luxuries were a shield, a spear, and a sword. As the princesses and the disguised Achilles gathered around, exclaiming over the silks and gems, a sudden, deafening blast of a war trumpet echoed through the hall. It was a signal staged by Odysseus's companion, on instinct reacting to a call to arms that was drilled into his very soul. Achilles tore off his robes and seized the weapons, his body moving into a fighting stance before his mind could even process the ruse. The disguise was shattered in a single, explosive moment. The warrior stood revealed, his true nature undeniable. In that instant, Odysseus had found his champion, and Thetis's final, desperate plan to save her son collapsed into nothing. The revelation had immediate and lasting consequences. With his identity exposed, Achilles prepared to join the Greek fleet, his destiny now firmly set on a collision course with Troy. But his departure from Scyros was not a clean break. In the time he had spent there, Deidamia had become pregnant. Shortly after he left for war, she gave birth to a son. They named him Neoptolemus, though he would also be called Pyrrhus, meaning red-haired, a name that echoed his father's disguised identity as Pyrrha. This child, born of secrecy and left behind on a peaceful island, represents a poignant and often overlooked thread in Achilles' story, the path not taken. Neoptolemus was the living proof of the life Achilles could have had, a life of peace, family, and legacy through his bloodline, far from the grim prophecies of war. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, this very son would later be summoned to Troy himself after his father's death, becoming a warrior known for his own ferocity and cruelty, thus ensuring that the cycle of violence would extend to the next generation. The interlude on Scyros, therefore, is not just a quirky anecdote about a hero in drag. It is a heartbreaking pause in the relentless march of destiny, a glimpse of an alternative life where love and family briefly triumphed over glory and fate. It shows us that Achilles was not a one-dimensional killing machine. He was a young man capable of deep connection, who experienced a fleeting taste of normalcy before the world tore him away to fulfill his tragic, legendary role. So the stage was set on the peaceful island of Scyros, a gilded cage where the world's deadliest weapon was hidden in plain sight, draped in the silks of a princess. But the gears of destiny would not be stopped so easily, and they found their agent in the most cunning mind the Greek world would ever know, Odysseus, king of Ithaca. He had heard the whispers, the same prophecies that haunted Thetis, and he understood that without Achilles, the 1,000 ships assembled for Troy were nothing but a grand, floating funeral procession. He arrived not with an army at his back, but with a merchant's smile and a cart full of treasures, a wolf in peddler's clothing. He was granted an audience with King Lycomedes and his court, including the bevy of princesses and their mysterious new companion, the fair-haired Pyrrha. With a showman's flair, Odysseus began to lay out his wares, creating a dazzling display designed to appeal to every feminine desire. He unfurled bolts of the finest, most delicate fabrics shimmering in the light. He presented intricately wrought jewelry, necklaces of gold and gemstones that caught the eye. The women, including the disguised Achilles, gathered around, their exclamations of delight filling the hall as they examined the luxurious trinkets. But nestled strategically within this collection of finery were objects of a completely different nature. Among the silks and jewels lay a brilliantly polished bronze shield, a heavy spear with a deadly, sharpened point, and a formidable sword. This was the heart of Odysseus's psychological trap. He knew that the trappings of civilization, the clothes, the manners, the careful performance, were only a thin veneer over the essential nature of the warrior Chiron had forged. You could dress a lion in lamb's wool, but you could not change its instincts. As the women oohed and awed over the trinkets, Odysseus and his companion, the warrior Diomedes, watched the one called Pirha with an eagle's focus. They saw the subtle glances toward the weapons, the slight tension in the posture that the flowing robes could not completely conceal. Then, on a pre-arranged signal, Diomedes gave the cue. Suddenly, a piercing, urgent blast of a war trumpet shattered the calm of the court. It was not a melody, but an alarm, a call to arms that signaled immediate and dire danger. The effect on Achilles was as instantaneous as it was irreversible. While the other women screamed and scattered in confusion and fear, his body moved with a mind of its own, a lifetime of training and innate talent overriding the conscious performance of the last several months. In one fluid, explosive motion, he tore the headdress from his hair and ripped away the constricting robes, sending silks flying. His hands, no longer hidden, shot out and seized the spear and shield, his fingers curling around the familiar grip of the weapons as if they were returning home. He dropped into a defensive crouch, his eyes alight with a fierce, predatory fire, his entire being radiating a power and readiness for combat that was utterly alien to the scene just moments before. The disguise was not just broken, it was obliterated. In that single, unthinking reaction, the hero stood fully revealed. The lion had roared. Odysseus, with a satisfied smile, simply looked at the transformed figure and said, "Greetings, Achilles." The war for Troy awaits. There was no denial possible, no return to the charade. His identity, and with it his fate, were now laid bare for all to see. The path to Troy was now open, and the final, inescapable act of his tragedy had officially begun. And so, with his identity unmasked and his path to war now undeniable, Achilles departed from the world of women and secrets, sailing toward a destiny that would consume him. But he did not go to Troy alone. Standing beside him, a calm and steadying presence against the storm of his own fierce spirit, was a figure who would become the true anchor of his soul, Patroclus. To understand the cataclysm that would later define Achilles, we must first understand this profound bond, a relationship so central to the epic that the entire story shifts on its axis the moment it is severed. Who was Patroclus? He was not a demigod, not a prince of immense power, but the son of a minor king named Menoetius. In his youth, a tragic accident, a fit of anger during a game of dice that led to the death of another boy, resulted in his exile. His father sent him to the court of King Peleus, not as a prisoner, but to be cleansed of his blood guilt and raised alongside the king's own son, Achilles. From the very beginning, their connection was different. Patroclus was older, but it was Achilles, the golden son of a goddess, who possessed all the brilliance and power. Yet, instead of rivalry, a deep and instantaneous affection blossomed. The young Achilles, perhaps isolated by his own extraordinary nature, found in Patroclus a companion who did not see him as a prophecy or a weapon, but simply as a person. In turn, Patroclus, gentle and principled, found in Achilles a purpose and a devotion that would define his entire life. They grew up together under the tutelage of the centaur Chiron, and their bond only deepened in the wilds of Mount Pelion. Where Achilles was all fire and impulse, a force of nature that needed direction, Patroclus was the embodiment of empathy and restraint. Ancient sources, from the poetry of Homer to the tragedies of Aeschylus, portray their relationship with a depth and intensity that transcends simple friendship. In the Iliad itself, Homer refers to Patroclus as the man Achilles loved beyond all other comrades, the most dear. Later Greek cultures, particularly in classical Athens, had no doubt about the nature of this bond. They viewed Achilles and Patroclus as passionate lovers, the archetypal model of an erotic and martial partnership between an older, wiser Erastes the lover and a younger, brilliant Eromenos the beloved. Whether one interprets their connection as a deeply romantic love or the most profound platonic friendship imaginable is in many ways a modern question that the ancient texts do not strictly divide. The essential, undeniable truth is that they were two halves of a single soul. Patroclus was the kindness to Achilles' rage, the caution to his recklessness, the moral compass for a demigod who often struggled to see beyond his own wounded pride. This dynamic becomes the very heartbeat of the Iliad once the war begins. When Achilles' pride is wounded by Agamemnon and he withdraws from battle, it is Patroclus who remains by his side in the long, idle days of their boycott. We see them not as general and subordinate, but as partners, sharing their fears, their frustrations, and their moments of quiet reflection. In one of the most humanizing scenes in the entire epic, we find Achilles in his tent playing a beautifully wrought lyre, singing of the famous deeds of warriors, with Patroclus sitting silently across from him, waiting for his friend to finish his song before he speaks. This is not the scene of a petulant warlord. It is a moment of profound domestic intimacy amid the chaos of a decade-long siege. Patroclus is the only one who can speak truth to Achilles' power. He is the one who challenges Achilles' inaction, not from a place of strategy, but from a place of shared humanity, pleading with him to have pity on their dying comrades. He is the keeper of Achilles' humanity, the living reminder that there is a world beyond the glittering prison of his own honor. When Patroclus finally begs to enter the battle himself, wearing Achilles' own legendary armor to terrify the Trojans and rally the Greeks, it is not a military decision, but a personal one, born of a desperate desire to help and to honor his beloved friend. Achilles, moved by Patroclus's compassion and fearing for his safety, agrees, but only under the strictest condition. He is to push the Trojans back from the ships, but he must not, under any circumstances, pursue them toward the walls of Troy. It is a plea from a lover who knows the reckless courage of the man he loves, projected onto his closest companion. In that moment, as Patroclus dons the armor that makes him a mirror image of Achilles, the two become one in a terrifyingly literal way, setting the stage for a tragedy of mistaken identity that will shatter the world. The Greek fleet, a forest of masts and sails, converged on the port of Aulis, a sight that must have seemed like the gathering of a myth made real. This was not just an army assembling, it was a who's who of the legendary age, each king and prince bound by the oath they had sworn years before to defend the marriage of Helen, now stolen by the Trojan prince Paris. At the forefront stood the towering figure of Agamemnon, king of the mighty city of Mycenae, a man whose ambition and pride were as vast as his authority. Beside him was his brother Menelaus, the wronged husband of Helen, his face a mask of grim determination and personal fury, the entire war being waged to restore his stolen honor and his stolen wife. And there, moving through the crowds with a knowing smile, was Odysseus, the architect of this very assembly, his mind already spinning the webs of strategy and deception that would be needed to breach the legendary walls of Troy. The air was thick with the sounds of clanking bronze, the shouts of commanders, and the lowing of the cattle being sacrificed to appease the gods for the coming voyage. It was a scene of immense chaotic power, a force of nature being harnessed for a single monumental purpose. And then, cutting through the chaos with an aura of their own, came the ship of Achilles. He arrived not as just another king, but as a phenomenon, the secret weapon everyone had been waiting for. His vessel was flanked by the 50 black ships of his Myrmidon warriors. The Myrmidons were not a rabble of conscripted soldiers. They were a professional, disciplined, and fiercely loyal fighting force, as relentless and organized as a swarm of ants, which in fact is what their name meant. They were utterly devoted to their commander, a young prince who was already spoken of in whispers, the son of a goddess, the pupil of a centaur. Achilles' arrival at Aulis was the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. For the other Greek kings, it was a moment of immense relief and bolstered confidence. With this demigod on their side, victory seemed not just possible but assured. For Achilles himself, it was the final, irrevocable step onto the path his mother had so desperately tried to steer him away from. He stood on the deck, looking out at the greatest military force the world had ever seen, a force he was now a central part of, his own destiny shackled to its outcome. But the gods were not yet finished sending their signs. As the sacrifices were made and the seers examined the entrails of the slaughtered animals, a chilling prophecy was delivered, one that would hang over the entire expedition like a shroud. The renowned seer Calchas, his voice trembling with the weight of the vision, revealed that Troy would not fall quickly. This would not be a swift raid of vengeance, but a grueling, protracted siege that would last for 10 long, bloody years. The news must have sent a ripple of dread through the assembled host. 10 years away from their homes, their kingdoms, their families. 10 years of disease, starvation, and constant battle. For the ambitious Agamemnon, it was a test of his resolve. For the lovesick Menelaus, it was a devastating delay. And for the young Achilles, it was the confirmation of his mother's most desperate fear. He had chosen, or been forced onto, the path of short, glorious life. The prophecy of a 10-year war meant he would not be returning from these shores. Every day he spent on the battlefield was a day counting down to his prophesied end, a clock that started ticking the moment his ship left Aulis. Yet another, even more horrifying omen followed, one that tested the very moral fabric of the expedition and revealed the dark cost of ambition. The fleet was ready, the sails were unfurled, but a supernatural, unending calm descended upon the sea. Not a whisper of wind stirred for weeks, trapping the 1,000 ships in the harbor as if they were toys in a bathtub. The great armada was paralyzed, and frustration and superstition began to fester among the ranks. Again, the seer Calchas was consulted, and the answer he gave was monstrous. He declared that the goddess Artemis, offended by Agamemnon, was responsible for the windless calm. The price for her favor, for the wind that would carry them to glory, was a human sacrifice of the most unthinkable kind, Agamemnon's own young daughter, Iphigenia. The story that unfolds is one of the most chilling in all of Greek mythology. Agamemnon, faced with the collapse of the entire war effort and the humiliation of returning home defeated before even setting sail, made his choice. He lured his daughter to Aulis under the pretext of marrying her to the great hero Achilles. When the innocent girl arrived dressed in bridal finery, she was instead led to an altar to be slaughtered by her own father. The myths vary on the outcome. Some say Artemis took pity at the last second and whisked Iphigenia away, replacing her with a deer on the altar, but the psychological impact was the same. Agamemnon had proven he was willing to sacrifice his own blood for his pride and power, and for Achilles, it was a brutal introduction to the cynical politics of this war he was now enmeshed in. His own name had been used as bait in a horrific deceit, a stark contrast to the honor and transparency he valued so deeply. Finally, with the grim ritual complete, the winds began to blow, filling the sails of the 1,000 ships. The massive fleet began to move, cutting through the waves toward the distant Trojan shore. The waiting was over. The war, with all its promised glory and its certain tragedy, had truly begun. For 9 long years, the sands of Troy were stained with blood, yet the great city's walls remained unbreached. The war had settled into a brutal stalemate, a grinding cycle of raid and counter-raid, where glory was measured in plunder as much as in battlefield prowess. Within this economy of honor, the spoils of war were not merely luxuries. They were the visible, tangible currency of a warrior's worth, a public acknowledgement of his strength and valor. A captured woman, in particular, was more than a servant or a concubine. She was a living trophy, a testament to her captor's martial excellence, and her presence in his tent was a constant, silent declaration of his status among his peers. It was into this volatile, honor-bound world that a crisis erupted, one that would tear the Greek alliance apart from the inside. A terrible plague descended upon the Greek camp, a divine pestilence sent by the god Apollo. Men and animals began to die not by Trojan spears, but by an invisible, wasting sickness, their bodies piling up for burning. The great warrior Achilles, seeing the army crumbling, finally called an assembly and demanded they consult a seer to understand which god they had offended and how they could appease him. The venerable prophet Calchas stood, but he was terrified to speak the truth. He feared the wrath of the most powerful man in the Greek army, Agamemnon, the leader of the entire expedition. Achilles, in a moment of principled courage, promised the seer his full protection, swearing that no one, not even Agamemnon himself, would touch him while he lived. Emboldened by this pledge, Calchas revealed the devastating truth. Apollo was punishing the Greeks because Agamemnon had arrogantly refused a ransom for his own war prize, a young woman named Chrysis. Her father, Chrysis, was a priest of Apollo, and he had come to the Greek camp humbly, bearing glittering treasures to buy back his beloved daughter. But Agamemnon had insulted the old priest, dismissing him with cruel threats and refusing to return the girl. Now, the god of the silver bow was unleashing his divine arrows in the form of a deadly plague, and the only cure was to return Chrysis to her father without ransom and without delay. Agamemnon's reaction was a masterclass in wounded pride and toxic authority. Cornered and humiliated by the public revelation that his selfishness was causing the deaths of his own men, he agreed to return Chrysis. But his consent was not an act of contrition, it was a transaction for his damaged ego. If he, the supreme commander, was to be deprived of his prize, the public symbol of his rank, then he would not be the only one to suffer the loss. He would simply take a prize from someone else to fill the void. His eyes swept across the assembled kings and landed squarely on the man who had just forced this humiliation upon him, Achilles. With cold, blunt entitlement, Agamemnon declared that he would be taking Achilles' own war prize, the woman Chrysis, as compensation. To him, it was a simple rebalancing of the scales of power, a reassertion of his supreme command. But to Achilles and to every warrior listening, it was an act of catastrophic, unforgivable disrespect. This was not about a woman in the way we might think of it today. This was about the fundamental code by which these men lived. Chrysis was the reward for Achilles' unmatched battlefield successes, a prize awarded to him by the entire army in recognition of his value. By seizing her, Agamemnon was not just taking a person, he was publicly stripping Achilles of his honor, his timere. He was effectively declaring that the contributions of the greatest warrior in the army were meaningless, that his glory was subject to the whims of a king who had not fought with the same ferocity. It was a profound violation of the very social contract that held the Greek alliance together. The response from Achilles was volcanic. This was not mere anger. The Greeks had a specific, powerful word for it, mernes. This term refers to a cosmic, righteous, soul-consuming rage, the kind of wrath reserved for gods and heroes, a force of nature that unravels fate itself. It is the first word of the Iliad, sing, goddess of the rage, the mernes of Achilles. His honor, the very core of his identity, had been shredded in front of the entire army. In that searing moment, every lesson from Chiron about balance and wisdom evaporated, replaced by the pure, unadulterated fire of his divine nature. He began to draw his sword, his mind flashing to the ultimate violence, killing Agamemnon there and then. As his hand tightened on the hilt, the goddess Athena, sent by a concerned hero who saw the entire war effort teetering on the brink of collapse, appeared to him alone. She did not command him, but counseled him. She urged him to sheath his sword and use his words as his weapons instead, promising him that far greater gifts and honors would be his in the future if he restrained his physical vengeance now. Heeding the goddess, Achilles slammed his sword back into its scabbard, but his words were daggers. He unleashed a torrent of fury, publicly shaming Agamemnon as a king who devours his own people, a coward who stays behind the lines while better men die for his ambitions. And then he made the most consequential decision of the entire war. He declared that he and his men, the formidable Myrmidons, would no longer fight. They would withdraw from battle completely. To prove his point, to make the Greeks feel his absence so painfully they would beg for his return, he took it a step further. He called upon his mother, Thetis, and when she rose from the sea foam to comfort her weeping son, he made a devastating request. He asked her to go to Zeus, the king of the gods, and plead with him to turn the tide of battle against the Greeks. He wanted the Trojans to win. He wanted his former comrades to be pushed back to their very ships, to be slaughtered on the beaches, all so that Agamemnon and the entire army would understand, in blood and terror, the true value of the hero they had so carelessly insulted. This was the ultimate weaponization of a hero's pride. In his quest for vengeance, Achilles was willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of his allies, the success of the very war he had come to fight, and ultimately the life of his closest friend, all for the sake of restoring his wounded honor. The wrath had begun, and it would cast a shadow over every death to come. And so, with that terrible oath sworn and his honor defended by words if not by action, Achilles turns his back on the war. He stalks away from the assembly, the air crackling with the tension he leaves in his wake, and retreats to the compound of his black-beaked ships where his loyal myrmidons are encamped. There he gives the order that will define the next phase of the conflict: stand down. No more patrols, no more sorties, no more fighting. The myrmidons, a perfectly tuned instrument of war, are sheathed. They stack their shields, lean their spears against the hulls of their 50 ships, and wait. For them, it is an order born of absolute loyalty to their commander. For the rest of the Greek army, it is a catastrophe in the making. The most potent fighting force in their entire coalition, the very tip of their spear, has been voluntarily blunted. The front line has just lost its champion, and a palpable dread begins to seep through the ranks, a chilling realization of just how much they had relied on the sheer, terrifying presence of the son of Thetis. This withdrawal is not a passive act of pouting. It is an aggressive, calculated strike in a new kind of warfare, a war of psychological and strategic attrition waged against his own allies. Achilles isn't just sitting in his tent. He is actively praying for their defeat. He watches day after day as the Greek army, now bereft of its greatest warrior, marches out to face the Trojans. And he watches with a cold, grim satisfaction as his mother's divine petition to Zeus is answered. The tide of battle turns decisively and brutally. The Trojans, emboldened by the absence of their most feared adversary, begin to push the Greeks back. No longer are the fights confined to the plains before the city. The Greek lines are compressed, buckling under relentless Trojan assaults led by the brilliant Hector. The fighting grows so desperate that it reaches the very edge of the Greek camp, to the defensive ditch and wall they built to protect their ships. The Greeks are forced into a fighting retreat, a slow, bloody slog back toward their own beachhead, their backs literally to the sea. This is the direct and devastating consequence of Achilles' wounded pride. His Mernes, his cosmic rage, becomes a tangible force on the battlefield, an invisible weapon that harms his own side more effectively than any Trojan spear. Every Greek soldier who falls, every comrade who is cut down while Achilles remains idle, is a testament to the destructive power of a hero's honor when it is placed above all else. He has made a chilling calculation. The restoration of his personal timber is worth more than the lives of thousands of his allies and the ultimate success of the mission he sailed to Troy to fulfill. In his mind, the Greeks must be made to feel his value through their own suffering. They must be brought to the very brink of annihilation so that Agamemnon, on his knees, will have no choice but to come to him, to apologize publicly, and to offer extravagant gifts of appeasement. This is the tragic, flawed logic of his wrath. He believes he is teaching them a lesson in respect, but the curriculum is written in Greek blood. The situation deteriorates to its most desperate point. The Trojans, led by a Hector who is tasting victory, breach the Greek defenses. They storm over the wall, setting fire to the first of the Greek ships. The glow of the flames reflects in the eyes of the Greeks, a symbol of their impending doom. If the ships are destroyed, their means of escape and communication with home are gone. They will be trapped on the Trojan shore, annihilated to a man. It is in this moment of existential crisis that the true cost of Achilles' pride is about to be revealed, not in the abstract loss of soldiers, but in the most personal, devastating loss imaginable. The central tragedy of the Iliad is not merely the death of heroes, but the chain of events that leads one man, through his own unyielding anger, to orchestrate the circumstances that will destroy the one person he loves most in the world. The stage is now set for Patroclus to make his fateful plea, and for Achilles' wrath to claim its ultimate, unintended victim. The momentum of the conflict shifts with a brutal and terrifying swiftness, a direct and undeniable consequence of the vacuum left by the Myrmidons' withdrawal. With Achilles and his fearsome warriors conspicuously absent from the front lines, the Greek army loses its psychological edge, its spearhead blunted. The Trojans, sensing this sudden weakness like a predator catching a new scent, rally with a ferocity they had not shown for years. At their head is Prince Hector, the steadfast guardian of Troy, who now fights with the confidence of a man who no longer has to fear the specter of the demigod who had haunted his every battle plan. He becomes an unstoppable force, a whirlwind of bronze and fury, cutting a swath through the Greek ranks, personally leading charge after charge that splinters their formations. The Greek advance, once a grinding but steady pressure against the city walls, collapses into a full-scale, chaotic retreat. The ordered ranks dissolve into a panicked mob of individual struggles as the Greeks are driven back, step by bloody step, across the plain they had fought so hard to claim, their backs now toward the only thing that connects them to home, the sea and their beached ships. The desperation of the situation is etched in the faces of every Greek soldier and made terrifyingly real by the fates of their most celebrated champions. This is no longer a war of raids and plunder, it is a fight for sheer survival. The great Diomes, who had earlier fought like a man possessed, even wounding the gods Ares and Aphrodite themselves, is struck by a well-aimed arrow from the bow of Paris, forcing him from the field, his phenomenal strength rendered useless. Next, the cunning Odysseus, the man of countless tricks and stratagems, is wounded in the ribs during a fierce melee, his clever mind no match for the overwhelming press of Trojan numbers. With these pillars of their defense either fallen or hobbled, the Greek command structure begins to fray at the edges. Agamemnon himself, the architect of this disaster, fights with a grim futility, his earlier arrogance replaced by the chilling realization that his authority cannot compensate for the loss of the army's true military linchpin. The front line, once held by a wall of heroic figures, now buckles and breaks under the relentless Trojan assault, and the sounds of battle are drowned out by the shouts of Trojan triumph and the agonized cries of dying Greeks. The fighting reaches a fever pitch of brutality at the very edge of the Greek camp. The Trojans, led by Hector, are no longer content with holding the field. They breach the defensive ditch and wall the Greeks had built to protect their fleet. The battle spills into the camp itself, a place that had been a sanctuary for 9 long years, now transformed into a bloody, chaotic killing ground. The air, once filled with the smells of cooking fires and the sea, is now thick with the coppery scent of blood, the smoke of burning huts, and the deafening clash of bronze. The Greeks make their final, desperate stand with the hulls of their ships at their backs, knowing that if the Trojans succeed in burning even a few of these vessels, all hope of ever returning to Greece is lost. They are trapped with the enemy in front of them and the unforgiving sea behind. Flames begin to lick at the stern of the first Greek ship, the fire a bright, terrifying symbol of their impending doom. In this moment of absolute crisis, the true, catastrophic cost of Achilles' pride is measured not in abstract concepts of honor, but in the very real and imminent destruction of the entire Greek expedition. The grand mission to reclaim Helen and humble Troy is about to end in a fiery, total defeat on the shore, all because one man, nursing a wounded ego, sat in his tent while his world burned. As the flames from the first Greek ship curl into the sky, a signal of imminent disaster visible from every corner of the camp, the arrogance that once defined Agamemnon finally crumbles into dust. Cornered by the consequences of his own pride and facing the total annihilation of his army, the great king swallows the bitterest pill of all: he must surrender. He calls a desperate assembly of the remaining Greek leaders and, in a stunning public reversal, admits his catastrophic folly. "The blind fury, 8, that Zeus sends has taken my wits," he confesses, his voice stripped of its former command. "I was blinded, I wronged the best of the Achaeans, I must make amends." The plan he proposes is one of absolute, extravagant appeasement. He will dispatch an embassy, not of common soldiers, but of the most respected figures left in the Greek camp, to the tent of Achilles. Their mission is to offer a king's ransom, the most lavish compensation imaginable, to lure the furious hero back to the battlefield. The delegation is a masterstroke of diplomatic weight. He sends Odysseus, the silver-tongued strategist, whose cunning mind is the perfect tool for a delicate negotiation. He sends the towering Ajax, Achilles' cousin, and the army's second greatest warrior, a man of brute strength and unshakable honor whose simple, earnest plea might appeal to Achilles' warrior spirit. And finally, he sends Phoenix, an old, revered tutor who helped raise Achilles in Peleus's court, a father figure whose presence is meant to pluck at the very strings of nostalgia and familial duty. The scene inside Achilles' compound is a study in stark contrast to the chaos outside. While the air beyond his ships rings with the screams of dying men and the clash of bronze, here there is an eerie, deliberate calm. Achilles sits in his tent, not brooding in darkness, but finding a moment of peace, his fingers plucking a clear, sorrowful melody from his finely wrought lyre. He sings of the famous deeds of heroes, a poignant choice that speaks to the legacy he is currently forswearing. Beside him, his beloved Patroclus sits in silence, a mirror to his troubled heart. The arrival of the 3 distinguished guests interrupts this fragile tranquility. They are welcomed with the traditional hospitality due to their station, water for their dusty feet, wine to soothe their parched throats, but the atmosphere remains thick with unspoken tension. It is Odysseus, the master orator, who breaks the silence. He lays out Agamemnon's offer with the skill of a master politician, presenting it not as a desperate bribe, but as a restoration of honor so complete it borders on deification. He details the staggering list of gifts, the return of Briseis untouched and with a solemn oath that she was never dishonored, 7 tripods never touched by fire, 10 talents of gold, 20 shining cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, and 7 skilled women from Lesbos. And then, the ultimate offer, the promise of a future woven directly into Agamemnon's own royal lineage, the hand of one of his daughters in marriage, along with 7 wealthy cities as her dowry, making Achilles a king in his own right and Agamemnon's own son-in-law. "Cast aside your anger," Odysseus implores, his words smooth and persuasive. "Rescue the grieving Achaeans from certain doom, and you will be covered in glory and wealth. If you continue to hold a grudge against Agamemnon himself, at least have pity on the rest of us, your comrades, being cut down piece by piece. For you, this will be your great glory. Hector waits for you, and you could strike him down." The speech hangs in the air, a magnificent, almost irresistible offer of everything a Homeric hero is supposed to desire: wealth, status, vindication, and the ultimate martial prize of killing the enemy's champion. Ajax, ever the blunt soldier, adds his own heartfelt plea, appealing to their shared warrior bond and the sacred duty of Philoteres, the love between comrades. Old Phoenix, with tears in his eyes, recalls rocking Achilles as a baby, feeding him, teaching him, and he tells a long, emotional parable about the dangers of clinging to a destructive wrath, begging him to accept the gifts and rise to his destiny. The entire Greek world seems to be pressing in on Achilles in that tent, offering him a triumphant return to the fold. And then Achilles speaks. His response is one of the most profound and shocking moments in all of ancient literature. He refuses, not with a fresh burst of rage, but with a new, chilling, and deeply philosophical clarity. He thanks his friends for coming, acknowledges the immense value of the gifts, but declares that they mean nothing to him now. "I hate his gifts," he says of Agamemnon. I hold him light as the dust, not if he gave me 10 times, 20 times over all he now has, not even if he offered me all the wealth of Egypt, would Agamemnon win my heart. This refusal is not about greed or holding out for a better deal. It is a fundamental rejection of the entire economy of honor that has governed his life. In this pivotal moment, staring into the abyss of his own mortality, Achilles has experienced a terrifying existential awakening. The insult from Agamemnon has shattered his previous worldview. He now sees that the prizes and glory he once fought for are utterly hollow, because they exist within a system controlled by fallible, arrogant men who can strip them away on a whim. No amount of treasure can erase the fundamental truth he has now grasped. A man's life cannot come back again, he states, his voice heavy with a new wisdom. It cannot be won back once it has passed the barrier of his teeth. He tells his friends the story of 2 possible fates he once held in his hands, the choice his mother Thetis laid before him so long ago: a long, peaceful, and anonymous life in his homeland of Thea, or a short, glorious life that ends at Troy. He reveals that he is now choosing, consciously and deliberately, the first path. He will pack his ships and sail for home at first light. He has realized that all the treasure in the world, all the public honor, is worthless if he is not alive to enjoy it. The promises of Agamemnon are insubstantial smoke compared to the simple, profound reality of drawing breath. This is not the petulance of a spoiled warrior. It is the heartbreaking maturation of a hero who has seen the gilded cage for what it is and has decided to break free, even if it means turning his back on the legend he was born to become. He would rather live as a forgotten man than die for a cause that has revealed its rotten core. In this refusal, Achilles becomes something far more complex and modern than a simple killing machine. He becomes a man grappling with the meaning of his own existence, and his ultimate conclusion is that life itself, however quiet, is the only prize of any real value. The crushing weight of Achilles' refusal settles over the embassy, leaving Odysseus, Ajax, and old Phoenix to depart with heavy hearts and the grim knowledge that no power on earth can now sway the resolute demigod. The fighting outside, however, does not pause for their failed diplomacy. It intensifies into a symphony of pure desperation. The air in Achilles' own compound, once a space for philosophical debate, now vibrates with the unmistakable, gut-wrenching sounds of the Greek collapse, the splintering of wood as another ship is rammed, the triumphant war cries of the Trojans, and most haunting of all, the agonized screams of men Achilles has fought beside for 9 long years. It is amidst this auditory tapestry of defeat that the final, pivotal figure in this tragedy finds he can remain silent no longer. Patroclus can no longer bear the dissonance between the quiet, principled stand inside the tent and the visceral, bloody reality unfolding just beyond its entrance. He bursts in, but not with the measured logic of a diplomat. He arrives as a man emotionally unraveled, his face streaked with tears not of fear, but of a profound, helpless empathy for the suffering he has just witnessed. His plea to Achilles is one of the most raw and emotionally charged moments in the entire epic, a stark contrast to the political bartering of the embassy. He does not appeal to pride, wealth, or even personal glory. He appeals to the one thing that has always anchored Achilles to his humanity: compassion. Pitiless one, he cries out, his voice choked with emotion. Your parents were not Peleus and Thetis, the grey sea and the jagged cliffs bore you, for your heart is so hard. This is not an insult, but a desperate, heartfelt accusation from the man who knows his soul better than any other. He lists the great Greek warriors he has seen carried back to the ships, wounded and broken. The healer Machaon, the spear thrower Eurypylus, men who are the very backbone of the army. He paints a vivid picture of the collective despair, of the best of the Achaeans lying in pain while their greatest defender sits idle. His argument is brilliant and deeply personal. He understands that Achilles' wrath is absolute and that no plea for Agamemnon will work, so he makes it about himself. if some dark prophecy from Zeus is holding you back or something your goddess mother told you, at least send me out, he implores. Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle and let me wear your famous armor. This is a masterstroke. It offers Achilles a path to aid his friends without forcing him to personally capitulate to the man he despises. It allows the army to see the image of their champion, to be rallied by the mere sight of his terrifying armor, and it gives Patroclus himself a chance to act on the overwhelming pity tearing him apart. Achilles' response to this emotional torrent is a complex storm of conflicting impulses. He is not moved by strategic concerns, but by the palpable pain of the man he loves. The sight of Patroclus weeping for strangers chips away at the stony wall of his rage. He confesses the truth, revealing that there is no prophecy holding him back, only the bitter, all-consuming wound to his honor. Yet, in the face of Patroclus's tears, that wound suddenly seems less important. He agrees, but his consent is laced with a frantic, almost prophetic anxiety. He gives his permission for Patroclus to lead the Myrmidons and to wear the armor that makes him the terror of Troy, but he wraps this agreement in a desperate, specific, and ultimately tragic command. Win me great honor, he says, and drive them from the ships, but once you have brought light back to the ships, you must stop. You must not, in your own fury for war, go on fighting without me against the Trojans. Do not lead the way to the city of Troy. He even voices a deeper, more superstitious fear, one that speaks to the fragile balance of the cosmos. One of the eternal gods might descend to the plain to join the fight. Apollo, who strikes from afar, loves the Trojans dearly. This moment is the fulcrum upon which the entire epic turns. In yielding to Patroclus's compassion, Achilles, for the first time, places the life of another person above the demands of his own wounded pride. It is an act of profound love, but it is a love fatally compromised by a terrible, ironic foresight. He sees the danger for Patroclus with a clarity he lacks for himself. He knows the intoxicating rush of battle, the fury for war that can cloud a warrior's judgment and make him reckless. He fears the gods who protect the city. In giving this strict command, he is trying to build a protective fence around Patroclus, to control the very chaos he is unleashing by sending his beloved friend into the fray wearing his own face. He is attempting to have it both ways, to ease the suffering of his comrades and soothe the conscience of his lover without fully recommitting to the war himself, all while keeping Patroclus safe within a narrowly defined zone of combat. It is a desperate, impossible bargain struck with fate, as Patroclus, his heart soaring with a sense of purpose and relief, begins to clatter and clang as he straps on the legendary, god-forged armor of Achilles. The two men become one in a terrifyingly literal sense. To the terrified Greeks and the emboldened Trojans, the figure that emerges from the Myrmidon camp will be Achilles himself, returned to the fight at last. But in that brilliant, deceptive fusion of identities lies the seed of catastrophe. Achilles, in his love, has set the stage for the one loss that will shatter his world forever, proving that the most dangerous wounds are not always dealt by an enemy's spear, but by the choices we make for the people we love. The moment Patroclus, clad in the gleaming, god-forged armor of Achilles, emerges from the Myrmidon camp, the atmosphere on the battlefield undergoes a seismic shift. The desperate, weary Greeks pinned against their own ships see the familiar, terrifying figure, the crested helmet, the massive shield, the spear that seems to drink the light, and a surge of wild, disbelieving hope ripples through their ranks. A great shout goes up, "Achilles, Achilles has returned to us." It is a cry that transforms their despair into a contagious, furious energy. For the Trojans, however, the sight is one of pure, unadulterated dread. Their momentum, which had felt like an unstoppable tide, instantly breaks against this single, psychological apparition. The mere belief that the son of Peleus is back on the field is enough to shatter their confidence. They do not stop to question, they simply break. Their orderly advance disintegrates into a chaotic scramble as they flee from the beach. thinking the specter of their greatest nightmare has been unleashed upon them once more. And in the center of this maelstrom, Patroclus is transformed. The armor is not merely a disguise, it is a vessel channeling a power and fury that is both alien and intoxicating to him. He is no longer just Patroclus, the gentle companion, the healer. Emboldened by the myrmidons at his back and the terror he inspires in his enemies, he becomes a force of nature. A divine frenzy, what the Greeks called Lyssa, descends upon him, a battle rage that is both magnificent and terrifying to behold. He fights with a skill and ferocity that seems borrowed from the demigod whose skin he now wears, cutting down Trojan captains with an ease that stuns both armies. He is everywhere at once, a whirlwind of bronze and death, driving the enemy back from the smoldering ships and across the plain they had fought so hard to win. His success is so complete, so overwhelming, that it begins to feel inevitable, as if the very hand of fate is guiding his spear. In this transcendent state, flushed with power and the ecstasy of victory, Patroclus makes a fatal error of perception. He begins to believe the illusion he has created. He starts to feel not just like a stand-in for Achilles, but as if he has become him, that the demigod's legendary prowess is now his own. This intoxicating confidence carries him far beyond the strategic objective Achilles had so clearly defined. The memory of his friend's desperate, specific plea, "Do not lead the way to the city of Troy," is drowned out by the roar of blood in his ears and the intoxicating chants of his name from the Greek soldiers. He does not merely push the Trojans back, he pursues them with a relentless, savage hunger, his Lyssa blinding him to all reason. 3 times he charges the towering walls of Troy itself, a feat of such audacious power that it draws the attention of the divine. Each time he attempts to scale the stonework, he is effortlessly repelled not by a mortal hand, but by the unseen, immense power of the god Apollo, who stands guard upon the ramparts protecting his favored city. In his divinely fueled arrogance, Patroclus does not recognize the divine intervention for what it is. He shouts a challenge into the air, a threat against the city that even the real Achilles had heeded as a boundary. In that moment, he crosses a line far more dangerous than any geographical one. He has moved from being the savior of the Greek ships to a mortal, audaciously challenging the authority of an immortal god. And in doing so, he has stepped directly into the path of the destiny Achilles had feared most. This transcendent state of power, however, is a dangerous and fragile illusion, a firework blazing at its brightest just before it gutters out into darkness. Patroclus, believing himself invincible while wearing the skin of a god, has forgotten his own mortality. He has ignored the plea of his friend and charged the sacred walls of Troy not once, not twice, but 3 times. And on that third, fateful charge, the god who has watched this mortal presumption with growing displeasure decides to act. It is Apollo, the archer god, the unwavering protector of the Trojan people, who now steps directly into the path of the onrushing warrior. The god does not even deign to draw his silver bow. He moves with an unseen, terrifying speed, coming up behind Patroclus and striking him with the flat of his godly hand between the shoulder blades. The blow is not meant to kill, but to humiliate and disarm. It carries the force of a divine thunderclap. Patroclus's vision blurs, his ears ring, and the strength drains from his limbs as if the strings holding him up have been cut. The magnificent helmet of Achilles, with its great horsehair crest, is knocked from his head, clattering loudly as it rolls under the hooves and feet of the battling soldiers. In an instant, the disguise is broken. The Myrmidons and the Trojans alike can now see the face of the man they have been fighting, not the invincible Achilles, but his companion, Patroclus. The aura of terror that had granted him such success evaporates, and he stands revealed, stunned, and terrifyingly vulnerable. Before his vision can even clear, before he can regain his footing in the churning dust of the battlefield, a second blow lands. A young, ambitious Trojan prince named Euphorbus, seeing the famed hero dazed and disarmed, seizes his moment for glory. He lunges forward and drives his spear into Patroclus's back, the point sliding between the shoulder blades. The wound is deep and grievous, piercing through his flesh. Patroclus stumbles, the weight of his own armor suddenly unbearable, but the spear of Euphorbus is not the killing strike. It is a wound that saps the last of his strength, pinning him in place, turning him from a whirlwind of destruction into a fixed and faltering target. He staggers away from the press of combat, trying to retreat toward the Greek lines, but his body is already failing him. And now the final player in this tragedy enters the stage. Hector, the champion of Troy, having seen the helmet fall and witnessed the spear thrust of Euphorbus, now sees his chance. He recognizes the man in the iconic armor, and he understands the deception that has been played upon his army. This is the moment for which he has waited for 9 long years, the chance to strike a decisive blow against the forces that have besieged his home. Hector approaches the wounded and reeling Patroclus. There is no grand duel, no heroic exchange of blows. The fight is already over. Hector's spear, a heavy ashwood weapon, finds its mark in the lower belly of the defenseless man, a brutal, mortal wound that spills his life's blood onto the ground before the walls of his city. Patroclus crashes to the earth, the bronze of Achilles' armor ringing a final, discordant chime against the stones. As the darkness begins to close in around his vision, he does not cry out in pain or fear. Instead, with his last shuddering breaths, he finds the strength for prophecy, his voice a hollow whisper filled with a terrible and certain knowledge. He turns his gaze to Hector, the man who stands victorious over him, and he speaks not of his own life, but of the death that now awaits his killer. "You boast over me, Hector," he gasps, "but yours is the greater doom. The death that is your destiny already stands near you, and you will be killed by the flawless Achilles." In these final words, Patroclus achieves a grim and tragic victory. He is not merely a victim, he becomes a seer, channeling the very voice of fate itself. He transfers the curse of his own death directly onto Hector's shoulders, ensuring that the Trojan prince's triumph is hollow and short-lived. Hector may have won the battle, but Patroclus, with his dying breath, has just declared the outcome of the war. He has bound Hector's life to Achilles' wrath as irrevocably as his own was bound to his friend's love. The turning point of the entire epic has been reached, not with a grand army's charge, but with the quiet, bloody fall of a single, compassionate man on the dusty plain of Troy. Back in the secluded compound of the Myrmidon ships, far from the roar of the battle he had just decisively influenced, a different kind of storm was brewing, one born not of strategy, but of a foreboding intuition. Achilles sat, his earlier philosophical calm gone, replaced by a restless, gnawing anxiety. He paced before his tent, his gaze fixed on the distant cloud of dust rising from the plains, his ears straining to interpret the sounds of combat. The triumphant shouts of the Greeks, which had surged when they saw his armor, had shifted in tone, becoming confused, then desperate. A cold dread, colder than the depths of the sea from which his mother came, began to coil in his stomach. He knew with a certainty that bypassed all reason that something had gone terribly wrong. His fears were confirmed by the sight of a lone, wounded runner, his tunic soaked in blood, stumbling toward the Myrmidon camp, his face a mask of horror. Before the man could even speak, Achilles' voice, raw with a terror he had never before known, cut through the air. Why have the fighting Greeks turned back in retreat? Tell me what has happened. Do not hide it from me, no matter how terrible. The messenger, Antilochus, could only fall to his knees, his words a choked whisper that carried the weight of the world's end. Patroclus has fallen. They are fighting over his body, stripped of your armor. Hector has it. The sound that erupted from Achilles then was not human. It was a raw, primordial scream of such pure, unadulterated agony that it seemed to tear a rent in the fabric of the world itself. He dropped to the ground, clawing at his face and hair, covering his head in the black, fertile earth as if to bury himself in it. The great, unconquerable Achilles was brought lower than any slave, his body convulsing with sobs that racked his entire frame. His cries were so piercing, so filled with a bottomless despair, that they carried across the battlefield and reached the ears of his mother, Thetis, far in her crystalline hall at the bottom of the ocean. She knew instantly the source of that sound, the sound of a prophecy fulfilled in the worst way imaginable. She rose from the waves with a retinue of her sea nymph sisters, their forms shimmering with a sorrowful light, and they found him there, prostrate in the dirt, his hands black with soil and tears. He looked up at her, his face a ruin of grief, and his words were not those of a warrior but of a broken-hearted child. "My mother, all of it, all the honor Zeus promised, it is nothing. Nothing, for Patroclus is dead. I sent him out to his death in my own armor. I loved him more than my own life, and I destroyed him." This was the true, devastating core of his sorrow. It was not merely the loss of a friend or a comrade. It was the shattering of his soul's other half. The love he felt for Patroclus, whether interpreted as the deepest fraternal bond or a passionate romantic attachment, was the anchor that had held his turbulent spirit fast. It was the kindness that tempered his rage, the wisdom that challenged his pride, the one connection that made his godlike power feel human. In sending Patroclus to battle, he had, in his own mind, personally guided the spear that killed him. His wrath against Agamemnon, his principled stand for honor, now seemed like a monstrous, petty folly. He had traded the living, breathing world of his beloved for the hollow echo of a bruised ego. His grief was so vast, so all-consuming, that it physically manifested, alarming the very gods on Olympus. The sea nymphs took up his terrible, keening cries, their voices echoing his pain across the water in a chorus of divine mourning. On the battlefield, the Greek and Trojan soldiers, locked in a brutal struggle over Patroclus's stripped and bloody corpse, paused for a moment, unnerved by the sound of a grief so powerful it seemed to shake the heavens. Thetis, her own immortal heart breaking for her mortal son, could do nothing but cradle his head and let him weep, her tears of nectar mixing with his tears of salt and earth. She had tried to save him from death, but she could not save him from this, the true death of the spirit that comes from losing the one person who gives life its meaning. In that moment, the famous wrath of Achilles, the Mernes that began the epic, underwent a fundamental and terrifying transformation. The diffuse, all-consuming anger he had felt toward Agamemnon and the entire Greek army, a fire that burned everything in its path, was now extinguished, replaced by something colder, sharper, and infinitely more focused. All the chaotic energy of his sorrow and self-loathing collapsed inward, condensing into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose: vengeance against Hector. Hector became the living embodiment of his pain, the only target upon which he could unleash the tsunami of his grief. He swore a terrible oath to his mother, his voice no longer a sob but a low, chilling whisper of absolute conviction. He would not bury Patroclus, he would not rest, he would not even taste food or drink until Hector's body lay broken at his feet. He knew the final part of the prophecy, the part he had so recently chosen to ignore, now awaited him. His own death would surely follow Hector's, but in the absolute void left by Patroclus's passing, his own life had lost all value. He would embrace that death willingly, eagerly, so long as he could first use it as a weapon to exact a perfect and final retribution. The hero was gone, the philosopher was gone. All that remained was an instrument of pure, divine vengeance, honed to a razor's edge by a love that had been violently, irrevocably lost. Yet even in his absolute, world-ending grief, Achilles knows that to fulfill his oath of vengeance, he cannot simply rush onto the battlefield as he is. His own legendary armor, the very symbol of his identity as a warrior, is gone, stripped from Patroclus's body and now worn triumphantly by Hector. He stands spiritually and physically exposed, a king without his crown, a weapon without its hilt. In this moment of ultimate vulnerability, it is his mother, Thetis, who acts. She understands that the mortal tools of war are insufficient for the cosmic task of sorrow her son now intends to undertake. Leaving him weeping on the shore, she departs from the world of men, ascending through the veils of mist and air to the one place where a fitting instrument for this tragedy can be forged, the divine forges of Mount Olympus. Her destination is the workshop of Hephaestus, the crippled god of fire, metal, and craftsmanship, a place that exists outside of time, lit not by sun but by the glow of celestial furnaces and the ring of a divine hammer. She finds him there, sweating and toiling amidst his automaton's golden handmaidens who move with thought and purpose, helping their master in his eternal work. The scene is one of immense pathos. Thetis, the beautiful sea nymph, approaches the lame and soot-stained smith god not with a command but with a mother's desperate plea. She reminds him of a time long ago when Hera, disgusted by his lameness, cast him out of Olympus, and how Thetis and her sister Eurynome had saved him, sheltering him in a cave beneath the ocean for 9 years. This is a call on an ancient debt of gratitude, a plea from one who was kind to an outcast god. She tells him of her son's plight, of the death of Patroclus, and of the armor lost to the enemy. Please, she begs him, fashion for my doomed son a glorious shield and a helmet and fine greaves with ankle straps and a corselet, for the armor he had was lost when his faithful companion was killed, and now he lies on the ground in anguish. Hephaestus's heart is moved immediately. He remembers her kindness and he pities the mortal fate of her magnificent son. Take comfort, he tells her, his voice echoing like bronze. Would that I could so surely hide him away from dismal death when dread destiny comes upon him, as I shall have magnificent armor for him, such as all men hereafter will marvel at whoever behold it. And so the god sets to work. He turns from her and bellows at his 20 bellows to blow on their own, sending a controlled, roaring inferno through the coals until the metals within his crucible, bronze, tin, precious gold, and silver, melt into a liquid, incandescent fire. He takes his massive, heavy hammer in one hand and precision tongs in the other, and the most famous act of divine craftsmanship in all of mythology begins. He does not merely forge a piece of defensive equipment, he creates a universe in miniature, a portable cosmos for a hero on the brink of annihilation. The centerpiece of this new panoply is the shield, and its creation is described with a poetic grandeur that elevates it from a weapon of war to a profound philosophical statement. Hephaestus begins by hammering out the very fabric of reality onto its shimmering surface. He forms the earth, the sky, and the sea that encircles all. He sets the heavenly bodies in their courses, the sun, the moon, and all the constellations that crown the night. This is the backdrop, the entire stage of existence upon which the human drama is about to play out. Upon this cosmic canvas, the god then etches the intricate tapestry of human life itself, presenting a world of breathtaking complexity and contrast. He depicts 2 beautiful cities. In the first city, there is peace and the rule of law. Hephaestus shows a wedding procession with young men leading brides through the streets by torchlight, while choirs sing and women stand at their doors to admire the spectacle. In the city's marketplace, an assembly is gathered to witness a legal dispute, a quarrel over the blood price for a murdered man. Elders sit in a sacred circle, taking turns to speak, holding staffs of clear-voiced heralds, while 2 talents of gold lie in the center, waiting to be given to the elder who pronounces the most righteous judgment. This is a vision of civilization at its most harmonious, a society governed by ritual, law, and communal celebration. Then he shows the second city, and it is a vision of that same civilization under siege. 2 armies glitter in bronze, locked in a stalemate around its walls. The debate among the besieged is fierce. Should they surrender and give up half their wealth or hold out? Meanwhile, an ambush is set. Warriors lie in wait by a river, and when a herd of cattle appears, they launch a savage attack, cutting down the herdsmen and igniting a brutal battle by the flowing water. This city shows the other side of the coin: conflict, difficult choices, and the violence that perpetually threatens to shatter civic order. But Hephaestus is not finished. His divine hammer continues to shape the metal, and he populates this world with the full, vibrant rhythm of daily existence, far from the walls of Troy. He forges a scene of a king's estate during the harvest, where laborers are reaping with sharp sickles, while the king stands among them in silent joy. In another quadrant, a vast golden vineyard is heavy with grapes, and young men and maidens are gathering them in woven baskets, while a boy plays a lyre and sings a beautiful, haunting song of loss. There is a herd of cattle being driven from farmyards to pasture by 4 herdsmen, with 9 golden dogs following, and suddenly 2 lions leap from an olive grove, seizing a bull from the front of the herd, and the herdsmen can only set their dogs, which bark and bay but dare not close in on the mighty predators. He even shows a meadow in a lush valley where skilled shepherds are shearing their flocks, and beyond them, a dancing floor where young men and women, the girls in linen, the boys in fine woven tunics, dance with breathtaking skill, whirling in circles, their movements like the potter's wheel, while a crowd stands around watching in delight. This is the shield of Achilles, not a simple disc of metal, but a living, breathing, and endlessly detailed portrait of a world at peace, at war, and at work. It is a panoramic vision of the entire human experience: love, law, labor, art, community, and the ever-present shadow of conflict, and herein lies its profound, heartbreaking irony. Hephaestus forges this magnificent artifact, this celebration of cosmic and human complexity, for a hero who has, in his soul, renounced it all. As Achilles straps this world onto his arm, he is not embracing the rich tapestry of life depicted upon it. He is, in fact, turning his back on every single scene. The weddings, the harvests, the dances, the legal disputes, the quiet joys of kings and shepherds. These are the very things he has just declared worthless in the face of his all-consuming grief and rage. The shield represents the life he could have had, the long, anonymous existence in Thea he told the embassy he now desired. A life filled with the mundane, beautiful, and complex realities of a functioning world. But he is no longer a part of that world. He is stepping onto the battlefield with a mind stripped down to a single, brutal purpose: kill Hector. The shield, in all its divine artistry, becomes a tragic paradox. It is a masterpiece depicting everything he is fighting against, a testament to the life he is about to sacrifice. He carries the entire, beautiful, complicated world on his arm, even as his heart closes itself off to everything but a singular, focused point of vengeance. He is armed with a universe in order to enact a private, personal apocalypse. With the divine armor of Hephaestus strapped to his body, a universe of peace and civilization hammered onto his shield, Achilles finally steps back onto the plains of Troy. But this is not the return of a hero rejoining his comrades. It is the arrival of an elemental force, a walking embodiment of vengeance so potent it alters the very air. His first action is one of chilling, premeditated theater. He does not head for the Trojan lines. He walks to the edge of the Greek camp and stands upon the defensive wall, a solitary, gleaming figure against the sky. And there he lets out a great cry, a sound not of challenge but of pure, undiluted fury. It is a sound that freezes the blood of every man on the plain, Greek and Trojan alike. The poet Homer tells us that the goddess Athena, standing behind him, amplifies this terrible shout, turning it into a supernatural weapon that sends a wave of paralyzing fear through the Trojan ranks. In that single moment, their morale, so carefully built by Hector, shatters. They look upon the figure they thought was gone forever, now radiant with divine armor, and they know that the war has just been reset to its first, most terrifying day. This performance is for his enemies, but his next move is for his allies, a piece of grim and necessary political theater. He seeks out Agamemnon. The meeting is not a reconciliation of friends, but a cold, formal cessation of hostilities between 2 powerful men who still despise each other. Achilles speaks first, his voice stripped of its former philosophical fire, now flat and transactional. He declares that he will no longer nurse his rage, that it is pointless to continue their feud while the enemy rejoices. He is in effect calling a truce so that he can more effectively kill Trojans. Agamemnon, for his part, offers a long, self-justifying speech, blaming Zeus and fate for his own arrogance, but he does not apologize. He reaffirms the extravagant gifts he promised during the embassy, the gold, the women, the tripods, the cities, and he swears a great oath that he never touched Briseis. The return of Briseis is the key that formally unlocks Achilles from his boycott. It is the public restoration of his honor, the symbolic closure of the entire quarrel. Yet, as the young woman is brought back to his tent, it is clear that these material things mean less than nothing to him now. The prizes, the wealth, the restored status, they are empty tokens. He accepts them not out of desire, but as a procedural step, a box to be checked so that he can turn his full, undivided attention to the only goal that gives his life meaning, finding Hector and making him pay. With the political formalities concluded, the slaughter begins. This is not the glorious, heroic combat of earlier days where champions sought each other out for single combat. What follows is one of the most sustained and horrifying sequences of violence in all of ancient literature. Achilles does not fight like a man, he fights like a natural disaster. His divine armor makes him impervious, his divine strength makes him unstoppable, and his all-consuming grief makes him merciless. He plunges into the Trojan ranks like a wolf among sheep, and the plain of Troy becomes a charnel house. The poet does not shy away from the graphic, intimate details of this massacre. We are told of spears piercing through temples, of heads being severed and rolling in the dust like balls, of men being split open from shoulder to navel. Achilles' chariot, driven by his faithful charioteer Automedon, becomes a grisly harvesting machine, its axle and rails splattered with blood and brains as he tramples the fallen. He is not just killing soldiers, he is dismantling human beings, his rage so absolute that it seeks the total obliteration of the enemy. He even takes 12 young Trojan noblemen alive, not out of mercy, but so he can later sacrifice them on the funeral pyre of Patroclus, an act of such brutal, sacrilegious vengeance that it shocks even his own comrades. This is the dark side of the heroic code laid bare, the unchecked, monstrous potential of the ultimate warrior when his humanity has been surgically removed by grief. The scale of his rage becomes so immense that it eventually provokes a response from the landscape itself. As he drives the shattered remnants of the Trojan army backward, a group of them, in a final, desperate bid for survival, leaps into the river Scamander, the great, life-giving waterway that flows across the plain of Troy. Achilles follows them into the water, and there, standing chest-deep in the current, he continues his butchery, turning the sacred river into a flowing ribbon of blood. The water chokes on the corpses, the reeds clog with the dead, and the river itself can take no more. The river god Scamander, personified as a powerful, bearded deity, rises from his depths and speaks to Achilles, his voice the roar of rushing water. He commands the hero to stop to carry out his killing on the dry land, for his channels are clogged with the dead and he can no longer flow cleanly to the sea. But Achilles, in his divine frenzy, has transcended all boundaries, even those between mortal and immortal, man and nature. He answers the god with defiance, and the confrontation escalates into a full-blown battle. Scamander summons his torrents, rising up in a great wave to drown Achilles, chasing him across the plain, scouring the banks and tearing trees from their roots in his divine fury. For a terrifying moment, it seems the very land of Troy is rising up to swallow its scourge. Achilles, for all his strength, is nearly overwhelmed, his lungs filling with water, his body battered by the divine current. It is only through the direct intervention of the gods Hera and Hephaestus that he is saved. Hera sends her son Hephaestus, the fire god, to ring the plain with celestial flames that boil the waters of the Scamander, forcing the river god to retreat, steam rising from his scorched banks. This battle with the river is not a mere fantastical interlude. It is the ultimate symbol of Achilles' rage. His grief has become so vast, so all-consuming, that it is no longer just a human emotion. It is a force of nature that challenges the fundamental elements of the world. He is not merely killing men, he is at war with the earth, the water, and the very order of the cosmos, all to feed the black hole of his loss. Through the carnage and the boiling river, Achilles' eyes remain locked on a single target, a figure glimpsed through the dust and chaos near the towering Scaean gates of Troy. It is Hector, the guardian of the city, the man who wears his own stolen armor, the killer of Patroclus. The sight of his beloved friend's panoply on the body of his enemy ignites a final, chilling focus in Achilles' soul. The indiscriminate slaughter ceases, the hunt is now personal. Across the blood-soaked plain, Hector stands his ground. He has watched the demigods rampage with a growing horror, and he knows in the deepest part of his being that this confrontation is the one he has dreaded for 10 long years. The old men and women of Troy, watching from the walls, cry out to him, pleading for him to retreat to the safety of the city, to not face this force of nature alone. But Hector's own heroic code will not allow it. He is the defender of Troy, the prince who must bear the brunt of its defense. He feels the weight of his people's hopes and his own honor, and in this moment that weight is heavier than any shield. He steels his heart, telling himself that he must stand and fight, that perhaps by the will of the gods he might yet prevail. It is a courage born of duty and desperation, a final, noble attempt to shield his home from the storm that has come for it. But as Achilles begins his final, relentless advance, something shifts in Hector's spirit. The poet Homer gives us a window into his mind, and what we see is not steadfast resolve, but a sudden, overwhelming terror. The image of Achilles drawing nearer is not that of a man, but of an elemental force, the gleam of the divine shield, the flash of the spear point, the sheer, preternatural speed of his movement. The courage that felt so solid moments before now melts away like wax before a fire. Hector's instincts, the pure human will to survive, overpower his sense of duty. He turns and he runs. He does not make a tactical retreat. He flees in sheer panicked terror. What follows is one of the most famous and heartbreaking chases in all of literature. Hector sprints along the base of Troy's great walls, past the watchful fig tree and the 2 springs that supply the city, with Achilles, his rage granting him supernatural speed, just a few paces behind. They circle the city 3 times, a grim and deadly parody of a foot race. The dust flies from their heels, and the scene is watched not only by the mortals on the walls, but by the entire pantheon of gods on Olympus. It is a spectacle of futility and fate, a mouse being toyed with by a divinely empowered cat. Achilles is herding him, cutting him off from any path to the gates, ensuring there is no escape. The great hero of Troy is reduced to a terrified fugitive running for his life before the very people he is sworn to protect. High on Mount Olympus, the gods look down upon this grim pursuit, and they are divided. This is not merely a conflict between 2 mortals, it is a proxy war for divine factions. Apollo, the protector of Troy, has favored Hector and given him strength throughout the war. But now the scales of fate are tipping. Zeus, the king of the gods, feels a pang of pity for the noble Hector. He takes out his golden scales, the instrument by which he measures the destinies of men in battle. He places 2 fates of death into the polished pans, one for Achilles and one for Hector. He holds the balance by the middle, and the scale of Hector's fate sinks down decisively toward the house of Hades, the underworld. The will of Zeus is made clear. Hector's hour has come. Apollo, seeing this divine judgment, must accept it. He withdraws his protection from the Trojan prince, leaving him utterly alone against his doom. But the gods are not passive observers. Athena, the goddess of strategic warfare and a fierce partisan of the Greeks, sees her moment to act. She cannot directly kill Hector, for that would violate the cosmic order, but she can engineer the circumstances of his death. She descends from Olympus, her feet barely touching the dusty plain, and appears beside Achilles, invisible to all but him, to assure him of her aid. Then she goes to Hector. In a breathtaking act of divine deception, Athena takes on the form and voice of Hector's beloved brother, Deiphobus. She appears at his side, seemingly having braved the field to stand with him in his moment of greatest need. To Hector, exhausted and despairing, this is a miracle, a renewal of hope. He believes he is no longer alone. With his trusted brother by his side, he finds a final reservoir of courage. He stops his desperate flight and turns to face Achilles, his voice ringing out across the space between them. He proposes a pact that whichever of them falls, the victor will swear to return the other's body to his people for a proper funeral rite. It is a last, dignified plea for a shred of humanity in the midst of the savagery, but Achilles' response is a snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Hector, speak not of agreements to me. There are no trustworthy oaths between men and lions, nor do wolves and lambs have like-minded hearts. There is no love between us, so now you must pay for the grief of all my comrades, but especially for Patroclus." In that moment, he rejects the entire civilized concept of truce and honor in battle. For him, this is not a duel between heroes, it is an execution. Hector, realizing the deception too late and understanding that he has been tricked by a god into making his final stand, knows there is no retreat. He hurls his spear with all his remaining strength. It is a perfect cast, aimed directly at the center of the legendary shield, but it strikes the divine metal of Hephaestus and bounces away harmless. The shield, a universe in miniature, has absorbed the best blow the greatest Trojan hero can muster. Now it is Achilles' turn. He poises his own heavy ashwood spear, its point gleaming with deadly intent. He searches for a gap in the armor he knows so well, his own armor, now worn by his enemy. He sees it, that small space where the collarbones meet the throat, the one spot left vulnerable. He throws, the spear flies true, a bolt of vengeance guided by fate and fury. It pierces Hector's neck, the soft flesh at the base of his throat, but does not sever the windpipe. It is a mortal wound, but not an instantly silencing one. Hector crashes to the earth, the dust rising around him. As his lifeblood pools on the ground, he uses his final, gasping breaths to utter a prophecy, just as Patroclus had done. He tells Achilles that his own death at the hands of Paris and Apollo is very near, and that it will come before the very gates of Troy. It is a final, grim gift of foresight, a curse to hang over the victor's hollow triumph. Achilles, his rage still unsated, simply wrenches his spear from the wound and strips his own armor from the dying man. The other Greek soldiers gather around, and in a final, horrific act of desecration, they each take a turn stabbing the body of the fallen prince, a communal violation that marks the complete and utter degradation of the once proud defender of Troy. The duel is over, the hero is dead, but for Achilles, the performance of his wrath is only just beginning. With the scales of fate irrevocably tilted and the divine support of Apollo withdrawn, Hector stands utterly alone before the storm of vengeance that is Achilles. The Trojan prince, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror and duty, makes one final, desperate attempt to cling to the codes of honor that have defined his entire life. As Achilles closes the distance with the grim finality of a falling axe, Hector calls out, his voice strained but clear, proposing the pact that heroes have sworn for generations. "If I kill you, I will give your body back to your people, and you will do the same for me." It is a plea for a dignified end, for the sacred rite of burial that separates civilization from savagery, a last hope that even in death, some fragment of humanity might be preserved between them. But the man who faces him is no longer operating within those codes. Achilles' reply is a guttural snarl, a verbal spear thrust that shatters any pretense of heroic decorum. There are no trustworthy oaths between men and lions, he hisses, his words dripping with a contempt so profound it feels colder than any weapon. "Do not speak to me of agreements." I would tear your flesh away and eat it raw if I could. There is no one who can keep the dogs from your head, not even if they brought 10 times or 20 times the ransom here. So now you must pay for the grief of all my comrades, but especially for Patroclus. In this rejection, Achilles consciously steps outside the boundaries of his own culture, declaring that his personal loss has rendered the collective rules of war null and void. This is no longer a duel, it is a sacrificial killing. Understanding the grim finality of his situation, Hector gathers his courage for one last defiant act. He knows he is going to die, but he will die as a warrior of Troy. With a final prayer to the gods, he draws his sharp sword, the only weapon he has left, and charges. It is a magnificent, hopeless gesture, the last flare of a noble spirit before it is extinguished. Achilles, calm and predatory, simply watches him come. He does not need to rush. He is clad in the divine armor of Hephaestus, a living fortress, while Hector wears the stolen panoply that Achilles knows as intimately as his own skin. His eyes, sharpened by a decade of warfare and a rage that grants him supernatural focus, scan the gleaming bronze. He is looking for the flaw, the one vulnerability he himself would have protected, the small space where the collarbones meet the base of the throat, the spot left exposed when a warrior raises his arm to strike. As Hector lunges, Achilles poises his own heavy, ash-wood spear, a gift from the centaur Chiron, its point honed to a wicked gleam. He throws it not with wild fury, but with the cold, precise certainty of a master craftsman. The spear flies true, a silver streak of vengeance guided by fate itself. It finds its mark perfectly, piercing the soft flesh of Hector's neck. The point drives deep, severing the vital passageways for life and speech, but with a cruel precision that leaves the windpipe intact. It is a wound that ensures a conscious, suffocating death. Hector crashes to the earth, the dust of his homeland rising to meet him. The impact is a dull, final thud that echoes the collapse of Troy's last, best hope. As the life drains from him, pooling in the dirt, he uses his last, choking breaths not for a plea, but for a prophecy. He looks up at his killer, his vision dimming, and whispers words that carry the weight of the future. I know you, and I know your destiny. Beware, Achilles, lest I become a curse upon you. Your own death stands very near, and you will be brought down by Paris and the god Apollo at the Scaean gates. It is a final, potent act of defiance, a curse that plants a seed of dread in the heart of the victory. He ensures that as Achilles stands triumphant, the shadow of his own doom falls across him. But Achilles, his heart a sealed chamber of grief, is unmoved. He wrenches his spear from the fatal wound and stands over the fallen prince. The other Greek soldiers, drawn by the end of the chase, gather around, and in a frenzy of shared hatred and released tension, they each take a turn stabbing the defenseless body. This communal violation is more than an act of war. It is a symbolic murder of Troy's honor, a deliberate, collective effort to erase the dignity of the man who was the city's soul. Yet for Achilles, even this is not enough. The physical death of Hector is insufficient to quell the maelstrom of his pain. He must enact a vengeance that transcends death itself, a punishment that continues beyond the final breath. He strips his own glorious armor from Hector's corpse, leaving the body broken and exposed. Then, with a chilling, methodical cruelty, he takes his knives and cuts slits through the tendons at the back of Hector's ankles, just above the heels. He threads through them strong ox hide straps, turning the prince's own limbs into bindings. He then ties the other ends of these straps to the back of his chariot, securing the body to his vehicle of war. With a sharp cry to his immortal horses, Balius and Xanthus, he whips the reins and kicks the chariot into motion. What follows is one of the most harrowing and iconic images of desecration in all of literature. Achilles, the triumphant champion, does not ride in a victory lap. He begins a long, grim circuit, dragging the naked, broken body of Hector behind him, around the tomb of his beloved Patroclus, and across the wide plain of Troy in full view of the city's walls. The head that once held the proud thoughts of a prince now bounces and tumbles in the dust. The face that was loved by a wife and father is shredded beyond recognition by the rough ground, stones, and thorns. The dark hair flows out behind, collecting dirt and debris, a terrible banner of defeat. This is not a tactical act, it is a performance of pure, undiluted hatred, a public spectacle of grief turned inside out. On the walls of Troy, King Priam and Queen Hecuba watch, their screams of anguish tearing at the sky, while Andromache, Hector's wife, faints away at the sight, her world ending not with a single death, but with this prolonged, brutal annihilation of her husband's very humanity. Achilles, driving his chariot, feels no triumph, only the cold, relentless pull of a grief so vast that it can only be expressed by systematically dismantling the physical form of the man who caused it, ensuring that even in death, Hector knows no peace. For days, the desecration continued, a grim and public spectacle that seemed to have no end. Inside the walls of Troy, the wailing of its people was a constant, agonizing sound, a city united in a single, searing grief. The sight of their noble prince's body, once their shield and pride, being dragged through the dust day after day, was a torment beyond any battlefield defeat. It was a spiritual violation, an attack on the very order of the world, where the dead are meant to be honored and returned to the earth. In his palace, the aged King Priam, who had already lost so many sons to the war, could bear it no longer. The father's love for his child proved to be a force more powerful than fear, more potent than royal protocol, and even stronger than the hatred for the man who had caused this pain. He made a decision that defied all reason and every rule of kingship. He would go himself, alone and unarmed, into the heart of the Greek camp, to the tent of his son's killer, and beg for the body back. It was an act of unimaginable courage, a gamble that placed the fate of Troy's king, and thus the city itself, on the slim chance that a sliver of humanity remained in the heart of the raging demigod. His family pleaded with him, horrified by the thought. His wife, Hecuba, begged him not to throw his life away, certain that Achilles would show him no mercy. But Priam was resolute. He declared that if he was to die, he would rather die clutching the knees of the man who killed his son than live another day watching the mutilation of his child's corpse. He gathered a wagon laden with an immense ransom finely woven robes, 12 magnificent cloaks, 10 talents of gold, shining cauldrons, and a priceless golden cup, a king's treasure meant to appease the most avaricious of hearts. But as he prepared to leave the safety of his city under the cover of night, his journey was aided by a power far greater than any mortal escort. The messenger god Hermes, the guide of souls to the underworld and the patron of travelers, took pity on the old king. Disguised as a young and noble Myrmidon warrior, Hermes met Priam's wagon outside the city, took the reins from his driver, and led them unseen through the Greek sentry lines, past the sleeping guards, and directly to the courtyard of Achilles' own compound. With a touch of his divine staff, he put the guards at the gate into a deep sleep, opened the massive bolt without a sound, and ushered the old king inside, revealing his true, radiant form for a fleeting moment before vanishing into the night. Priam was now utterly alone, standing in the enemy's innermost sanctum. The scene that unfolded next is one of the most profoundly moving in all of world literature, a moment where the epic scale of gods and heroes collapses into the raw, intimate reality of two men bound by a shared, devastating loss. Achilles was inside his tent, having just finished his evening meal. His companions, including the aged Phoenix, were still with him. The air was likely thick with the grim satisfaction of vengeance, but also with the hollow emptiness that follows such an act. Suddenly, the tent flap opened and the old king walked in. Before anyone could react, before Achilles could even rise to his feet, Priam did the unthinkable. He moved quickly across the room, fell to his knees, and clasped the hands of Achilles, the very hands that had slain his son, that had wielded the spear and dragged the body, and he brought them to his lips and kissed them. It was an act of ultimate supplication and self-abasement, a king reducing himself to less than a slave to appeal to a higher law. Trembling, Priam looked up at the stunned warrior and began to speak. His words were not those of a king demanding his due, but of a father stripped bare by grief. He did not mention ransoms or treaties or the war. Instead, he reached across the divide of age, nationality, and enmity to find the one point of connection that could possibly pierce Achilles' armored heart. "Remember your own father, O Achilles, like to the gods," he pleaded, his voice choked with tears. "He is of the same age as me, on the dreadful threshold of old age. And perhaps those who live near him harass him, and there is no one to ward off war and ruin from him. Yet he, when he hears that you are still alive, rejoices in his heart and hopes each day that he will see his beloved son returning from Troy. But I am utterly cursed." He then painted a picture of his own wretchedness, describing how he had fathered the finest sons in all of Troy, and now not one of them remained. "The one who was the best of them all, the guardian of our city and ourselves, you have lately killed as he fought for his country, my Hector. For his sake I have come to the ships of the Greeks to win him back from you, and I bring a ransom beyond counting. Achilles, fear the gods and take pity on me, remembering your own father. I am even more pitiable, for I have borne what no other mortal on earth has borne. I have kissed the hand of the man who killed my son." The effect on Achilles was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The wall of rage he had so carefully and ferociously maintained for weeks, the identity he had forged as an instrument of pure vengeance, shattered into a million pieces. The mention of his father, Peleus the old, mortal king, waiting for a son who would never come home, acted as a key, unlocking the deep well of human sorrow that his divine fury had suppressed. He thought of his own fate, of the certain death that awaited him, and of the grief his father would soon endure, a mirror image of the grief he saw before him now in the broken form of King Priam. Achilles began to weep, not the hot tears of anger, but the deep, shuddering sobs of shared humanity. He gently took the old man's hands and pushed him away, not in rejection, but in a gesture of respect, so they could look upon one another as equals in suffering. For a long time, the two most important figures in the war, the killer and the father of the killed, sat together in the tent and wept. One for Hector, the perfect son and fallen hero, and the other for Patroclus, the beloved companion, and for his own father and his own doomed life. In that shared release of tears, the cycle of vengeance was broken, not by a treaty or a battle, but by the simple, overwhelming power of compassion. Achilles then stood, a new resolve settling upon him. He helped the elderly king to his feet and spoke to him with a gentleness that seemed impossible just hours before. He agreed to return Hector's body, and he ordered his women servants to wash and anoint the corpse, to clothe it in fresh, fine robes, all so that Priam would not be angered by the sight of his son's wounds and risk provoking Achilles' wrath anew. He himself lifted Hector's body onto the wagon that would carry him home, handling it with the care of a brother. He then ensured Priam ate and drank, persuading the grieving father that he must sustain his strength, and he even arranged for a truce of 12 days so the Trojans could conduct a proper, unhurried funeral for their prince. As a final act of profound empathy, as Priam prepared to leave under the returning protection of Hermes, Achilles looked at him and saw his own father's face. He thought of Peleus alone and awaiting news that would never come. And in a moment of heartbreaking foresight, he warned the old king not to come to the Greek camp again, for if he did, Achilles might not be able to control the rage that the other Greeks could provoke. He sent him off in peace under the cover of the same divine night that had brought him. The ransom was accepted, the body was returned, but the true transaction that occurred in that tent was not one of gold for a corpse. It was an exchange of grief, a mutual recognition of loss that, for a brief, luminous moment, transcended the hatred of a 10-year war and revealed the fragile, beating heart of humanity that exists within even the most legendary of heroes. The return of Hector's body to Troy did not mark a return to war, but a pause, a sacred interval of shared grief that momentarily stilled the clash of swords on the plains. For 9 days, a truce held as the Trojans, led by a broken King Priam, mourned their greatest hero with all the solemnity his station demanded. They built a towering pyre, and upon it they laid Hector, their guardian, and set it ablaze, the flames a final, defiant beacon of his honor against the encroaching darkness. But while the smoke from Hector's pyre drifted over the city walls, another, more personal ritual of mourning was unfolding in the Greek camp. For Achilles, the desecration was over, but the grief remained, a vast, unquiet ocean within him. He knew that to truly honor Patroclus, to send his soul peacefully to the underworld, he had to perform the proper rites, and so he turned his immense energy and resources to creating a funeral worthy of the man he had loved more than life itself. The pyre for Patroclus was a mountain of sorrow, built from countless logs of fragrant cedar, oak, and pine hauled from the forests of Mount Ida. Upon this wooden hill, Achilles placed the body of his friend, washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in fine linen. But his tribute did not stop there. In a gesture that speaks to the depths of his grief and the brutal customs of his time, he sacrificed a grim offering to accompany Patroclus on his final journey. Those 12 young Trojan noblemen he had captured alive during his rampage were brought forth and slain upon the pyre, their lives a bloody libation to the memory of his companion. He then added sheep and cattle, jars of honey and oil, and finally, a final heartbreaking sacrifice of his own. He cut off his own long, golden hair, the very symbol of his heroic youth and beauty, and laid it in the hands of his dead friend. This was not merely a custom, it was the severing of a part of his own identity, a promise that a part of him would journey with Patroclus into the land of the dead. As the flames roared to life, consuming the immense structure, Achilles called upon the winds themselves, and his mother Thetis, rising from the sea with her sister Nereids, summoned the breath of the north wind, Boreas, and the swift west wind, Zephyrus, to fan the inferno until the entire pyre was reduced to white-hot embers. For an entire night, Achilles lay exhausted beside the smoldering ashes, sleep offering no refuge from his pain. At dawn, he and his myrmidons gathered the bones of Patroclus, placed them in a golden urn, and sealed it with a double layer of fat, setting it aside to one day be mingled with his own. Only then, with the physical act of cremation complete, did a strange and necessary transformation begin to take hold in the Greek camp. The air, so long thick with the stench of death and the cacophony of rage, needed to be cleansed. Achilles understood this not just for himself, but for the entire army, which had been fractured by his wrath and battered by a decade of war. To mark the end of the deep, formal mourning and to facilitate a return to the community of warriors, he announced that he would hold magnificent funeral games in honor of Patroclus. This was a brilliant and deeply cultural act. In the world of Homeric heroes, athletic contests were not mere entertainment. They were a sacred ritual, a way to channel aggressive, competitive impulses into a structured, honorable, and life-affirming outlet. These games would serve as a collective catharsis, a ritual cleansing that would allow the Greeks to reconnect with the codes of honor and camaraderie that had been shattered by the quarrel with Agamemnon and the subsequent slaughter. For Achilles, it was a final, public act of devotion, a way to celebrate the memory of Patroclus not with tears, but with the very excellence, the arete that defined their shared world. The games themselves were a spectacular display of wealth, skill, and the rekindling of social bonds. Achilles, as the host and the sponsor, provided all the prizes from his own vast share of the plunder, a treasure trove of tripods, cauldrons, horses, women skilled in crafts, and ingots of precious iron. The first and most prestigious event was the chariot race, a breathtaking and dangerous spectacle of speed and strategy. The greatest drivers entered, the cunning Diomes, the steadfast Menelaus, the cunning Antilochus, the veteran Myrrhians, and the mighty Eumelus. The course was a long, grueling loop, and the race was filled with the drama and near disasters inherent in such a contest. Diomedes, driving horses gifted by the gods themselves, took the lead, but Antilochus, son of Nestor, showed his mettle with a brilliantly daring and dangerously close pass that forced Menelaus to rein in his own horses or risk a catastrophic crash. As the chariots thundered back toward the finish line in a cloud of dust, it was Diomedes who claimed the first prize, a woman and a magnificent tripod. But the true drama unfolded afterward. Antilochus was awarded second place for his audacious drive, but Menelaus, furious at what he saw as reckless and dishonorable tactics, formally challenged him, accusing him of cheating. A younger man might have bristled, but Antilochus, demonstrating the very honor the games were meant to foster, immediately apologized, conceding that his youth had made him foolish and offering his own second-place prize to Menelaus. The older king, his honor satisfied, magnanimously refused, allowing the young prince to keep his prize. This resolution was a microcosm of the game's purpose. A conflict arose, but it was settled through words and a shared respect for the rules, not through violence. It was the Greek army healing itself, one contest at a time. The events that followed were a showcase of the varied forms of heroic excellence. Next came boxing, a brutal and raw test of endurance. The competitors were Achilles, who boldly declared his supremacy in the art of fisticuffs, and Euryalus, a proven warrior. The fight was short and savage. Achilles lived up to his boast, landing a crushing blow that sent Euryalus sprawling, his legs buckling beneath him like a fish leaping from the water and landing in the weeds. His comrades carried him, spitting blood and with his head lolling to one side from the circle, a stark reminder of the physical cost of glory. Then came the wrestling, a contest of leverage, grip, and sheer strength between the two greatest warriors left in the camp after Achilles, the massive Ajax and the cunning Odysseus. This was a titanic struggle, with neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. When Ajax lifted Odysseus for a throw, Odysseus, ever the strategist, would hook his leg from behind and bring them both crashing to the ground, covering each other with dust. 3 times they tried for a clean fall, and 3 times they ended in a draw. Finally, Achilles himself intervened, declaring the contest a tie and dividing the prizes equally. A diplomatic solution that honored the immense effort of both heroes and prevented any new grievance from festering. The games continued with a foot race where the swift Odysseus, aided by a prayer to Athena, narrowly defeated the younger Ajax and Antilochus. There was the armed duel, a simulated fight to first blood between Diomedes and Ajax, which had to be stopped by the anxious onlookers when Ajax's thrust became too terrifyingly real. Then came the shot put, using a lump of raw iron that Achilles offered as a prize, a valuable tool that could be hammered into plowshares or weapons. The massive Ajax hurled it the farthest, winning a prize that was as practical as it was symbolic. The final events turned to precision and skill. The archery contest pitted Merians against the renowned archer Teucer. The target was a delicate and terrifying one, a dove tied by its foot to the mast of a ship. Teucer shot first, but in a twist of fate, only severed the cord that held the bird, letting it fly free. Merians, seizing the moment, knocked his arrow and, as the dove soared into the sky, let it fly, piercing the bird through its wing in mid-air, a stunning display of accuracy that won him the prize. Lastly came the javelin throw, but here, without even a contest, Achilles simply stood and awarded the prizes. He gave the first to Agamemnon, acknowledging his position as overall commander, a subtle but significant public gesture that formally closed the book on their bitter quarrel. The games concluded not with a final, dramatic victory, but with this act of political and social reconciliation. The catharsis was complete. The Greeks had spent a day not killing each other, but competing with and honoring one another. They had argued, triumphed, failed, and reconciled, all within a sacred framework of rules and respect. For Achilles, presiding over it all, it was his final, magnificent gift to Patroclus. He had created a moment of perfect, ordered glory, a vibrant celebration of life and skill, as a final tribute to the man who had represented the best of that world to him. The laughter and cheers that echoed across the plain were a stark contrast to the wails of grief and the screams of battle that had preceded them. In honoring the dead, the games had momentarily restored the living, binding the army together once more and allowing Achilles, for a brief, shining moment, to be not just the instrument of wrath, but the noble king and host he was always meant to be. The peace, however, could not last. The shadow of his own prophecy now fell across him with a renewed and chilling clarity. With Patroclus honored and the army united, the last thread tethering him to life had been cut, and the final, inexorable steps of his destiny now awaited him at the Scaean gates. With Hector's funeral games concluded and the brief, fragile truce dissolved, the war for Troy resumed, but the conflict had been forever altered. Achilles, having exhausted the volcanic fury of his personal vengeance, now fought with a chilling, detached inevitability. The prophecy foretold his death after Hector's, and with that first part fulfilled, he seemed to be living on borrowed time, a ghost haunting the battlefield, clearing a path for his own demise. His rampage became less about personal honor and more about the grim, mechanical business of fulfilling his destiny, piling glory upon glory in the short span he had left. It was during this period that two of the most celebrated and tragic allies of the Trojans arrived, each presenting a final, poignant test for the weary demigod. The first was Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, a tribe of legendary warrior women from the east. She arrived not for plunder or political alliance, but to cleanse a personal shame, having accidentally killed a sister and seeking purification through the glory of battle. She was a breathtaking figure, a whirlwind of martial skill and fierce beauty, and she cut through the Greek ranks with a prowess that momentarily stunned them. She and her warriors created such chaos that they very nearly broke the Greek lines, a testament to their formidable power. Driven by the din of this new threat, Achilles finally entered the fray to confront her. The duel between the son of a sea goddess and the daughter of the war god Ares was a clash of titans, a spectacle of supreme martial artistry. Yet, for all her skill and divine heritage, Penthesilea was ultimately mortal, and no match for the relentless, preordained force that was Achilles. In the heat of their combat, he drove his spear home, striking her down. As she fell, her helmet was knocked from her head, and in that moment, the legend tells us, Achilles saw her face. A profound and tragic sorrow washed over him as he beheld her beauty and courage, a fleeting glimpse of a life and a spirit that could have been a kindred one in another world, another story. This was not like the killing of Hector, fueled by hatred. This was a death met with a sudden, devastating regret. As he stood over her, lost in this poignant moment, a common Greek soldier named Scyros, a man known for his ugliness and vile tongue, mocked Achilles for his apparent grief and cruelly mutilated Penthesilea's corpse. In a flash of fury at this disrespect, Achilles turned and struck Scyros dead with a single blow, an act that sowed discord among the Greeks but underscored the complex, noble grief he felt for a worthy opponent he was fated to destroy. No sooner had this drama concluded than another formidable ally appeared to bolster the desperate Trojans, Memnon, the king of Ethiopia. Memnon was no ordinary warrior. He was the son of the dawn goddess Eos, making him, like Achilles, a demigod. He arrived with a vast army, a figure of immense stature and radiant armor forged by the god Hephaestus himself. In Memnon, the Trojans found a new Hector, a champion to rally behind, and for Achilles, the fates had seemingly provided a mirror image, a son of a goddess, a warrior of unparalleled might, whose life was also shadowed by prophecy. The two demigods clashed in what was arguably the most epic duel of the entire war, a battle that felt like the cosmos itself had paused to watch. The gods were divided, just as they had been for Hector and Achilles, with Zeus once again weighing their fates in his golden scales. The pan holding Memnon's fate sank downward, sealing his destiny. Achilles, true to his own, drove his spear through the Ethiopian king. The death of Memnon was a watershed moment. His mother, Eos, was so consumed by grief that she wept tears of morning dew and begged Zeus for a favor, who granted Memnon a form of immortality, turning him into a bird or a smoke that would reappear each year. For Achilles, this victory was the absolute peak of his martial career, the last great obstacle thrown in his path. He had defeated his equal, the only other hero in the war who could truly stand as his counterpart. With Memnon and Penthesilea slain, the path to the Scaean gates was clear, and the final, unfulfilled part of the prophecy now tightened its grip. It was at those very gates, the main entrance to the city he had besieged for a decade, that his story reached its destined end. The agent of his death was not a noble warrior in open combat, but the very man who had started the conflict, the Trojan prince Paris. Cowardly and reliant on his archery rather than close-quarter fighting, Paris had long been a figure of contempt on the battlefield. Yet he was the favored mortal of the god Apollo, the archer god who had been insulted by Agamemnon at the war's start, and who held a deep grudge against Achilles for his sacrilege in defiling Hector's body and for his general hubris. Guided and empowered by Apollo, Paris took his shot. The most famous version of the story, the one that has resonated for millennia, is that the god guided the arrow directly to the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel, the place where his mother Thetis's fingers had gripped him as she dipped him in the river Styx, leaving that small patch of his flesh untouched by the sacred water's invulnerability. The arrow, perhaps poisoned, struck true, piercing the tendon and sending a wave of paralyzing weakness through the mighty warrior. There are, however, other compelling and richly detailed versions of his death that add layers to the myth. In one older and more brutal account, Achilles was not merely shot from a distance, but was in the midst of a triumphant assault, storming the gates of Troy itself, believing victory was finally within his grasp. In this version, he was at his most magnificent and most arrogant, and it was in that moment of supreme overconfidence that Paris, with Apollo's direct aid, struck him down. Another tradition suggests that Achilles was not just shot in the heel, but that the arrow found a more conventionally fatal spot, with the Achilles heel being a later, symbolic interpretation of his one mortal flaw. Some stories even claim that Apollo did not merely guide the arrow, but took on a visible form, perhaps that of Paris, and fired the fatal shot himself, a direct divine punishment for a mortal who had challenged the natural order. As he fell, the great hero's final moments were likely consumed not with the glory of battle, but with the bitter knowledge that the prophecy had been fulfilled exactly as foretold. The very first prophecy his mother had received, that he would die at the gates of Troy, and the final curse whispered by the dying Hector, that he would fall by the hand of Paris and Apollo, had converged into a single, fatal truth. The aftermath of his death ignited one last heroic struggle. The Greeks, realizing their champion had fallen, fought with desperate fury to recover his body and his divine armor from the Trojans, who sought to claim the ultimate trophy. The epic battle over Achilles' corpse became a legend in its own right. The two greatest Greek warriors left, the massive Ajax and the cunning Odysseus, formed a legendary rearguard, holding back the overwhelming Trojan forces in a display of immense bravery. Ajax, with his towering shield, was like a bulwark against the sea, heaving back entire ranks of soldiers, while Odysseus fought with shrewd ferocity beside him. They managed to retrieve the body and carry it back to the safety of the Greek camp, but the effort was Herculean and cost many lives. This act of salvation, however, would soon spawn its own tragic sequel. When Achilles' magnificent armor, the set crafted by the god Hephaestus, was to be awarded to the bravest Greek warrior left alive, it sparked a fatal contest between Ajax and Odysseus. Both laid claim, and when the command was swayed by clever argument and perhaps divine intervention toward Odysseus, the honorable Ajax was so consumed by wounded pride and shame that he fell into a madness sent by the goddess Athena, eventually taking his own life. Thus, the death of Achilles cast a long shadow, claiming yet another of Greece's greatest heroes and proving that the consequences of his passing would ripple through the rest of the war, leaving the Greeks victorious but utterly hollowed out by the price of their legendary triumph. And so, the great shield of Achilles, bearing its silent, beautiful world of peace and civilization, fell still. The demigod who carried a universe on his arm met his end not in a blaze of glorious combat with an equal, but through a guided arrow, a divine conspiracy that targeted the one small, mortal part of him he could never escape. His journey, from the moment his mother held him in the divine fire to his final breath before the Scaean gates, was an epic symphony composed of the most powerful and conflicting human emotions, played out on a grand mythological scale. He was the ultimate paradox, a figure torn ceaselessly between the immortality he was offered and the humanity he could not shed. He possessed the power to shape the outcome of a 10-year war, yet he was powerless against the prophecies that bound him. He could slaughter armies and defy a river god, but he was utterly vulnerable to the wounds of a bruised ego and most devastatingly to the loss of a single beloved friend. Achilles' story is at its heart the story of a choice between a long, quiet life and a short, glorious one. But his legend reveals that this is not a simple binary. It asks whether a life of anonymous peace is truly living if it denies the very essence of one's being, and whether a life of legendary glory is worth the price when that price is everything that makes life precious. His cosmic rage, his menace, was not just the petulance of a spoiled warrior. It was the explosive reaction of a man whose entire sense of worth, built upon a rigid code of honor, was publicly shattered. Yet that same capacity for all-consuming feeling is what made his love for Patroclus so profound. Their bond was the anchor to his own humanity, the quiet center around which his stormy spirit revolved. In the end, his wrath and his love were two sides of the same coin, the immense, terrifying capacity of his heart to feel things more deeply than any ordinary man. His tragedy was that his greatest strength, his passionate intensity, became the instrument of his own undoing, leading him to orchestrate the circumstances that would cost him the one person who gave his life meaning. His legacy is the very definition of the Greek hero. He is not a sanitized, perfect champion, but a magnificently flawed, brilliantly human one. He is arrogant yet compassionate, brutal yet cultured, divine yet heartbreakingly mortal. He is a warning against the dangers of hubris, the excessive pride that challenges the gods and destroys the individual, and yet he is also a testament to the raw, beautiful power of human connection. He teaches us that honor is not just a public currency, but a deeply personal code, and that love can be a force as powerful and destiny-altering as any god's decree. His story forces us to look at our own lives and our own choices. What would we be willing to sacrifice for our name to be remembered? How do we balance our personal honor with our responsibilities to others? And when faced with an impossible choice, how do we find meaning in the path we ultimately walk? The tale of Achilles does not end with his death on the plains of Troy. It echoes through the ages because it speaks to the core of the human condition, our struggle with pride, our yearning for love, our fear of mortality, and our desperate hope to leave a mark on the world that outlasts our brief time within it. He is unforgettable not because he was invincible, but because he was so vulnerably, passionately, and tragically human. So we turn this over to you. What does the story of Achilles mean to you? What do you think it teaches us about the true nature of honor, the transformative power of love, and the way we face our own mortality? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives and continuing this ancient conversation. And if you want to join us for more deep dives into the myths and legends that have shaped our world, be sure